Harry Potter sat in the Gryffindor common room, his potions essay spread out in front of him but barely touched. The fire crackled warmly, casting shadows across the room, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Across from him, Hermione Granger sat cross-legged on the couch, completely focused on her parchment. Her quill scratched rapidly as she filled line after line with her neat handwriting. It was not unusual for Harry to see Hermione buried in her work. In fact, it was one of the most familiar sights of his life. But lately, something about watching her study felt different. He had always admired her intelligence and determination, but now there was a warmth in his chest every time she smiled or leaned over to explain something to him. He tried to ignore it at first, but the feeling had grown over the past few weeks, and it was becoming impossible to deny. Ron Weasley was dozing in a chair nearby, his head tilted back, snoring softly. The sound was oddly reassuring, as it meant Ron was not paying any attention to Harry's shifting expression whenever Hermione spoke. Harry knew Ron liked Hermione in his own awkward way, but the thought of it made Harry's stomach twist. Hermione glanced up from her work and caught Harry looking at her. She smiled in that quick, distracted way she did when she was deep in thought. Harry's face warmed, and he quickly looked down at his essay, pretending to write something. "You are being ridiculous," he told himself. "She is your best friend. She has always been your best friend." But the words did nothing to quiet the restless energy that had taken root in him. Over the next few days, Harry found himself noticing more than he ever had before. The way Hermione's hair glinted like dark gold when sunlight from the library windows caught it. The way she tilted her head slightly when she was trying to understand something. The way her laugh, rare but genuine, seemed to make everything else fade away. It was a cold Saturday morning when the three of them made their way down to Hogsmeade. Snow dusted the ground, and the air was crisp with the scent of frost. Hermione walked ahead, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, strands of hair escaping into the wind. Harry had to stop himself from staring too long. Ron was talking about the latest Quidditch match, but Harry's responses were automatic, his thoughts elsewhere. They went to the Three Broomsticks, finding a small table in the corner. Madame Rosmerta served them steaming mugs of butterbeer, and the sweet warmth was welcome after the cold outside. Hermione began talking about a book she had read over the summer, her voice animated and her hands moving as she explained a point. Harry found himself leaning forward, watching her lips form each word, not because of the topic, but because it was her speaking. Ron, however, looked less than thrilled. "Honestly, Hermione, not everything needs to turn into a lecture," he muttered, sipping his drink. Hermione's eyes narrowed. "It's not a lecture, Ron. It is interesting." Harry stepped in quickly. "I think it is interesting," he said before he could stop himself. Hermione's face softened, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. The sight of it made something flutter in his chest. Back at Hogwarts that evening, Harry sat in the common room again, this time pretending to read. Hermione was nearby, curled up with a book. The room was quieter than usual, most students having gone to bed. Harry was tired, but the thought of leaving her side made him want to stay awake as long as possible. He thought about what it would be like to tell her. The idea seemed absurd. She probably thought of him as just Harry, the boy she had stuck with through danger after danger. What would she say if she knew? Would it ruin everything? The thought made his chest tighten. Still, something inside him whispered that maybe she could feel the same. Maybe the small moments, the lingering looks, the way she always chose to sit beside him, the way her hand brushed his in the library, meant something more. Or maybe they meant nothing at all, and he was only imagining it because he wanted it to be true. A sudden noise interrupted his thoughts. Ron stumbled down from the boys' dormitory, rubbing his eyes. "You two are still up? What are you doing?" he mumbled. "Reading," Hermione said without looking up. Harry shut his book. "I was about to head up," he said quickly, standing. He caught Hermione's eyes for a moment longer than necessary before turning away. That night, lying in bed, Harry stared at the ceiling. His mind kept circling back to that look, that smile in Hogsmeade, the way she made him feel lighter just by being around. He did not know where this was going, but one thing was certain, it was not going away. In the days that followed, Harry found himself trying, and failing, to act normal. He offered to help Hermione carry her books from the library, even though it meant juggling his own. He lingered at breakfast until she finished eating, walking with her to class even if it made him late for something else. She did not seem to notice anything unusual, or if she did not say. One afternoon in the library, they sat together in their usual spot. Hermione was working on an arithmancy assignment, her brow furrowed in concentration. Harry was supposed to be revising for defense against the dark arts, but he was hopelessly distracted. He watched the way her quill moved across the parchment, the way she bit her lip when she was thinking. Without looking up, Hermione said, "You are awfully quiet today." Harry blinked. "Just tired, I guess." She gave him a quick glance. "You should get some rest. You have been pushing yourself too much lately." Her concern made him smile faintly. "I will. Promise." When they finally left the library, the corridors were dim with the setting sun. They walked side by side, their steps echoing softly. Harry felt an urge to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. As they reached the common room, Hermione smiled at him again. "Good night, Harry." "Night," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She disappeared up the staircase, leaving him standing there with the weight of everything unsaid. Harry knew this was just the beginning of something that could change everything, and he was not sure if he was ready for it. But he also knew he could not stop it, no matter how much he told himself to. The next week at Hogwarts passed in a blur, but to Harry, every moment with Hermione seemed to carry a new weight. The smallest things stuck in his mind. The way she smiled when she figured out a tricky problem, the way her laughter echoed softly in the empty common room late at night, the way she brushed a strand of hair out of her face without even noticing she had done it. Ron, however, had started to notice something else. He could not put his finger on it, but there was a change in Harry's behavior. He lingered around Hermione more than usual, asked her about homework he did not even need help with, and seemed almost too quick to agree with whatever she said. Ron's eyebrows would furrow whenever he caught Harry watching her for just a bit too long. It was a rainy Thursday when they were walking to herbology. Harry had arrived at the common room earlier than usual just to wait for Hermione, pretending he had forgotten his bag so he could leave with her. When she finally appeared, her hair slightly frizzy from the damp air, he felt his chest warm. "Ready?" she asked, adjusting her scarf. "Yeah," Harry said, falling into step beside her. Ron joined them halfway down the corridor, his gaze flicking between the two of them. "You could have waited for me," he said to Harry. "I thought you were still asleep," Harry replied quickly. By the time they reached the greenhouses, the rain had picked up. Professor Sprout was explaining the properties of some rare magical plant, but Harry barely heard her. He kept stealing glances at Hermione, who was listening intently, her hands carefully handling the delicate leaves. When she caught him looking, she smiled faintly, and he quickly busied himself with his own plant, though his fingers felt clumsy. Later that evening, the three of them were in the common room. Ron was playing a game of wizard chess against Seamus, which freed Harry to sit at the table with Hermione. She was working on her transfiguration essay, and he was supposed to be doing the same, but instead he watched the way her quill moved, the way she tapped it thoughtfully against her parchment. "You are staring again," she said suddenly, without looking up. Harry blinked. "What? I wasn't." Hermione gave a small smirk. "Yes, you were. Is there something on my face?" "No," Harry said quickly, his ears going warm. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, finally glancing up. He hesitated, his mind scrambling for something harmless. "About the essay. I'm stuck on a sentence." Her eyes softened, and she leaned over to look at his parchment. "Let me see." Her hair brushed his cheek as she leaned closer, and the faint scent of her shampoo filled his senses. Harry's heart thudded, and he forced himself to focus on her words as she explained how to structure the sentence. When she sat back, he gave a quiet thanks, but his mind was still spinning from the closeness. The weekend brought a trip to Hogsmeade, and this time Ron stuck to Harry's side the entire walk there. The three of them wandered through the village, visiting honeydukes and zonkos before stopping at the Three Broomsticks again. Ron was unusually quiet, though Harry caught him glancing at him and Hermione more than once. After they returned to Hogwarts, Harry and Hermione stayed in the library, while Ron went off to play Exploding Snap with Dean and Neville. It was peaceful, the only sound the soft rustle of pages. "You didn't get much from honeydukes this time," Hermione remarked, looking up from her book. Guess I wasn't that hungry, Harry replied. In truth, he had been too distracted to care about sweets. Hermione tilted her head. You've been quiet lately. Are you sure everything's all right? Harry hesitated. Yeah, just a lot on my mind. She studied him for a moment longer, but did not press. Instead, she smiled gently and went back to her reading. Harry wished he could tell her that she was the reason his thoughts had been a mess lately, but the words felt impossible to say. That night, Harry climbed into bed only to find Ron sitting on his own bed, looking at him curiously. What? Harry asked, pulling off his glasses. Ron shrugged. You've been acting different. Hanging around Hermione a lot more. Agreeing with her on everything. Not that it's bad, but it's just a bit odd. Harry's stomach tightened. She's my friend, Ron. We've always spent time together. Yeah, but this feels different, Ron said, his tone unreadable. Just saying. Harry turned away before Ron could see the heat rising to his face. You're imagining things, he muttered, though even to his own ears, it sounded unconvincing. As the days went by, Harry found himself more and more aware of Ron's watchfulness. Every smile Hermione gave him, every time she leaned close to explain something, every laugh they shared, Harry could feel Ron's eyes flick between them. It was as if Ron knew something was shifting, even if Harry himself wasn't ready to admit it out loud. Still, no matter how much he told himself to stop thinking about Hermione like this, the feeling kept growing, warm and unstoppable. And somewhere deep down, Harry knew it was only a matter of time before he would have to face it, and face Ron too. The air between Harry and Ron had changed. It was not obvious enough for anyone else to notice, but Harry could feel it in the way Ron spoke to him, the pauses before he replied, the way his eyes sometimes narrowed when Harry and Hermione were talking. It started small. At breakfast, Ron made a joke about Harry, practically moving into the library, just to keep Hermione company. Harry laughed it off, but he caught the way Ron's expression stayed serious for a moment too long. One afternoon in the common room, Ron had been telling a story about Fred and George's latest prank when Hermione walked in, balancing a pile of books. Harry instantly got up to help her carry them. Ron's voice faltered, and by the time Harry sat back down, the conversation had shifted into silence. Hermione noticed that silence more than anyone. She was not oblivious. She could tell something was off between the two boys. But she did not know why. Harry had always been close to her, and Ron had always been Ron, sometimes argumentative, sometimes easygoing. Now, however, there was a stiffness in the air when the three of them were together. It came to a head in the library a few days later. Hermione had insisted they work on their charms essays together, so they sat in their usual spot, books and parchment spread out before them. Ron, however, was restless. This is pointless, Ron muttered, pushing his parchment away. We already know the charm works, so why bother writing 5 feet about it? Because Professor Flitwick asked us to, Hermione replied without looking up. Harry grinned slightly at her tone. You know she's right, he said to Ron. Ron shot him a look. You'd agree with her if she told you the sky was green. Harry blinked, caught off guard. What's that supposed to mean? It means you've been acting weird, Ron said, leaning back in his chair. Following her around, agreeing with everything she says, looking at her like. He stopped himself, but the damage was done. Hermione's head snapped up. Like what? Nothing, Ron said quickly, grabbing his quill again. Harry's pulse quickened. You don't know what you're talking about. Ron gave a short laugh. Don't I? The tension between them was thick enough that Hermione finally closed her book. All right, what is going on with you two? You've both been acting strange for days. Nothing's going on, Harry said quickly. Ron did not argue, but the way he slammed his book shut said otherwise. The walk back to the common room was silent. Hermione walked between them, glancing from one to the other, clearly trying to work out what she had just missed. That night, Harry lay awake in bed, Ron's words replaying in his head. Looking at her like. Ron had stopped before saying it, but Harry knew exactly how it would have ended. Like you like her. And the truth was he did. The next day, Harry tried to keep his distance from Hermione, thinking it might ease Ron's suspicions. But every time he saw her, in class, in the hallways, at meals, that familiar warmth returned. He could not switch it off. In potions, they were paired together, and Hermione's concentration was fierce as she measured out ingredients. Harry found himself staring until she caught him. She smiled faintly. "What?" she whispered. "Nothing," he muttered, turning back to the cauldron. But Ron, who was working at the next table, had seen it. By the weekend, Hermione had had enough of the strange silences. They had planned to spend the afternoon by the lake revising, but as soon as they sat down, she turned to face Harry directly. "Harry," she said softly, "is something wrong between you and Ron?" Harry hesitated. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'm not blind," she said. "You're both my friends, and I can tell when something's off. He's been quiet, you've been different. I don't know what's going on, but I wish you'd just tell me." Harry's throat felt dry. He wanted to tell her everything, about the way he had started to feel, about how Ron seemed to notice before he could even admit it to himself. But the words refused to come. Instead, he said, "It's nothing really. Just Ron being Ron." Hermione gave him a searching look, clearly unconvinced, but she let it drop. For now. As they sat in the cool breeze, Harry glanced at her from the corner of his eye. The sunlight danced on the water, catching the warm tones in her hair, and he thought, I can't keep this a secret forever. Ron was right, something had changed. And sooner or later, Hermione was going to see it too. Over the next week, Hermione began to notice more than just the tension between Harry and Ron. She started picking up on the subtle ways Harry seemed to focus on her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. Maybe he was simply being more attentive because of how busy their schedules had become. But then there were the moments that made her pause. Like in the Great Hall during breakfast, when she had been talking about her arithmancy assignment and realized halfway through that Harry was not really listening to the words. He was just looking at her. He blinked and quickly glanced at his plate when she caught him, but the image stuck in her mind. Or the time in the library when she had leaned across to grab a book and their hands brushed. It was the briefest contact, but she felt Harry freeze for a moment before continuing to write. Ron, on the other hand, was becoming less subtle with his frustration. He still spoke to Harry, but his tone was often short, and there were times when he seemed to make an effort to keep Hermione's attention away from him. If Harry started a conversation with her, Ron would find a reason to interrupt or change the subject. One evening, the three of them were working in the common room. Harry was sitting next to Hermione, leaning slightly toward her as they compared notes. Ron sat across from them, not bothering to hide his disapproval. "You know," Ron said suddenly, "it's a miracle Harry's keeping up in class with all the time he spends staring at you." Hermione's quill stopped mid-word. She looked from Ron to Harry, who had gone very still. "I don't stare at her," Harry said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. Ron raised his eyebrows. "Right." Hermione looked at Harry for a long moment, her mind turning over Ron's words. She did not say anything, but there was something new in her expression, a flicker of curiosity mixed with confusion. The next day, Hermione found herself watching Harry more closely. In defense against the dark arts, she caught him glancing at her during Professor Lupin's explanation of a complex spell. At lunch, he passed her the pumpkin juice before she even asked. These were small things, but when she pieced them together, they started to form a picture she was not sure she was ready to understand. That afternoon, she and Harry were walking back from the library alone. The corridors were quiet, their footsteps echoing softly. Hermione decided to test a theory. "You've been different lately," she said casually. Harry glanced at her. "Different how?" I don't know. Quieter. More thoughtful, I suppose. And you've been spending a lot more time with me." Harry's stomach tightened. "We've always spent time together." "Yes, but this feels different." She kept her tone light, but her eyes searched his face. Harry tried to keep his voice even. "Maybe you're imagining it." "Maybe," Hermione said, but she did not sound convinced. They reached the portrait hole, and before Harry could say anything else, she gave him a small smile. "Good night, Harry." He watched her disappear up the stairs, his mind a jumble. She was starting to notice. That night in the dormitory, Ron made no effort to hide his annoyance. "You two looked cozy on the way back from the library," he said from his bed. Harry sighed. "We were just talking." "Sure," Ron said, his voice laced with disbelief. Harry rolled onto his side, choosing not to reply. He knew Ron was not going to let this go, but right now, he was more worried about Hermione. If she was already sensing his feelings, It was only a matter of time before she confronted him directly. And when that happened, Harry had no idea what he was going to say. Hermione woke up the next morning with her mind still turning over the things she had noticed about Harry. She told herself she might be overthinking, but deep down she knew she was not. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that had not been there before. It was not the easy comfort of long friendship. It was warmer, more hesitant, like he was holding back a truth he could not yet say. In class that day, she decided she would pay close attention. If she was wrong, she would know soon enough. It started in charms. They were practicing a delicate levitation charm on tiny crystal spheres. Hermione deliberately fumbled with her wand, sending the sphere wobbling dangerously. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Harry tense immediately, ready to steady it for her. When she regained control, his shoulders relaxed, and he gave her a small, relieved smile. She returned it, watching the faint color rise in his cheeks before he quickly looked away. At lunch, she sat beside him rather than across. She noticed how he shifted slightly to give her more space, how he passed her things without being asked, how he seemed to listen to her even when she was talking to someone else. Each small detail added to the quiet certainty forming in her mind. Ron, however, was another matter entirely. He barely spoke to Harry during the meal, answering questions with short replies and keeping his gaze on his plate. That afternoon in the library, Hermione decided to try something more deliberate. She leaned across the table, close enough that her hair brushed Harry's arm, and asked, "Can you explain this line in the text? I'm not sure I understand it." Harry froze for a split second before leaning closer. His voice was calm, but his proximity was cautious, as if he was afraid to move too much. Hermione listened, pretending to take notes, but she was more interested in the way his eyes kept flicking to hers and then darting away again. When they left the library, Ron was waiting in the corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "You two seem to spend an awful lot of time in there lately," Ron said, his tone light but edged with something sharper. "It's called studying, Ron," Hermione replied before Harry could speak. "Sure," Ron muttered, falling into step beside them. But his silence for the rest of the walk back said more than words could. That evening in the common room, Ron pulled Harry aside while Hermione was upstairs. "All right, I'm done pretending I don't notice," Ron said quietly but firmly. "You like her?" Harry's pulse quickened. "Ron, don't bother denying it," Ron interrupted. "I see the way you look at her. And I don't like it." Harry took a breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "She's my friend. She's your friend. That's all." Ron shook his head. "Not for you, it isn't. And if you're smart, you'll leave it at that." Before Harry could reply, Ron walked away, leaving him standing there with his thoughts spinning. When Hermione came back down later, she noticed the tension immediately. "Everything all right?" she asked softly. "Yeah," Harry said, though his voice was flat. Hermione studied him for a moment, but did not push. She was sure now, Harry felt something for her. What she did not know was how deep it ran, or what it might mean for their friendship. Still, as she sat beside him that night, the flicker of curiosity in her chest grew stronger. If Harry had been hiding his feelings, she was determined to understand them, and maybe, just maybe, see where they would lead. Hermione decided that if she wanted to understand Harry's feelings, she needed to see how he acted when it was just the two of them. The next few days, she made small adjustments to their routines, subtle enough that Ron wouldn't immediately notice. It began with her suggesting they study together in quieter, more secluded places. Instead of the usual library table near the entrance, she led Harry to a tucked-away corner in the far back where almost no one went. The shelves around them created a small, private space, and the air felt different, not tense exactly, but charged. Harry seemed both relaxed and nervous in these moments. He would sit close enough that their elbows sometimes brushed, but he always made sure there was just enough space between them, as though afraid to push it too far. One evening, she asked him to help her with a particularly complex transfiguration problem. He leaned in to see her notes, his shoulder touching hers. Hermione didn't move away. For a brief second, she caught his gaze, and he looked like he wanted to say something but lost the courage at the last moment. The following morning at breakfast, Ron joined them late. He dropped into the seat across from Harry, eyeing the two of them as if he'd walked into the middle of something. "Where were you last night?" Ron asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Library, Hermione said smoothly before Harry could answer. Of course, Ron muttered, stabbing at his eggs. Later that day, Hermione found Harry in the courtyard between classes. The sun was out for once, melting the patches of snow on the ground, and the air was crisp. She smiled at him. Walk with me? They wandered around the edges of the castle, away from the noise of the main corridors. Hermione talked about her homework, the weather, little things, but she was watching Harry carefully. Every time she laughed, he smiled. Every time she touched his arm to make a point, his steps faltered just slightly before continuing. They reached a quiet spot overlooking the lake. The water shimmered faintly, reflecting the pale blue sky. Hermione sat on the low stone wall, and Harry stood beside her, hands in his pockets. It's nice out here, she said softly. Yeah, Harry replied, but his eyes were on her, not the view. Hermione turned her head, meeting his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt heavier, filled with things unspoken. She almost asked him outright, but before she could, the sound of footsteps broke the moment. Ron appeared from around the corner, his expression unreadable. There you are, he said, his voice clipped. I've been looking everywhere. We were just talking, Hermione said, sliding off the wall. Ron nodded, but the tension in his jaw was obvious. The three of them walked back together, and the silence was far more uncomfortable than the quiet she and Harry had shared moments earlier. That night in the common room, Harry seemed distracted. He kept glancing at Hermione, as though still thinking about their time by the lake. She, too, found her mind drifting back to it. The way he had looked at her, the way he had hesitated as if caught between speaking and staying silent. Hermione was beginning to realize something important. If she kept finding moments alone with Harry, the truth would eventually come out. The question was whether she was ready to hear it, and what it would do to the three of them when it did. The days after the Quidditch match were quieter, but Harry's thoughts were anything but calm. He kept replaying the image of Hermione smiling at him after his victory, her voice carrying that proud tone that warmed him far more than the cheering crowd ever could. She was spending more time with him lately, not because they had planned it, but because their schedules and study sessions kept overlapping. Still, Harry was beginning to feel that every moment with her meant more to him than she could possibly realize. The common room one evening was unusually noisy, with Gryffindors celebrating their win days later, as though it had just happened. Ron was in the center of it, reenacting Harry's dive to catch the snitch, exaggerating the danger and speed until people were howling with laughter. Harry laughed along, but his eyes kept drifting to the corner of the room where Hermione sat with her legs curled under her, reading quietly. She had tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and the firelight danced across her face. He suddenly realized he would rather be there, next to her, than in the middle of the crowd. Slipping away without anyone noticing, Harry wandered toward her table. She looked up when he approached, closing her book halfway. Her smile was small but warm. You escaped, she said softly, as though she knew he needed the quiet. I think I've heard enough of my flying skills for one lifetime, Harry replied, sitting down. Besides, I'd rather be here. Her brow rose slightly, as if she was about to ask what he meant, but she only said, You could help me with this essay if you like. I'm trying to make sure my arguments are as airtight as possible. Harry leaned in, reading over her parchment. She smelled faintly of peppermint, probably from the tea cooling beside her. He tried to focus on her words, but his mind kept drifting to how close their shoulders were, how the soft sound of her voice seemed to block out all the noise from the rest of the room. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, until Ron appeared at the table with 2 butterbeers in hand. There you are. I was wondering where you'd gone, Ron said, placing one in front of Harry without asking. Hermione, you should have seen. I have seen, Hermione interrupted with a smile. You've been acting it out for 2 days now. Ron laughed, but his eyes darted between Harry and Hermione, and something in his expression tightened. Harry recognized it, a hint of that same tension he'd noticed before, though Ron didn't say anything. He stayed for a few minutes, but eventually drifted back to the crowd, leaving Harry and Hermione alone again. When they finally closed their books for the night, Hermione stood, stretching slightly. You've been quieter than usual, she said, her eyes searching his. Just tired, Harry replied automatically, though that wasn't the whole truth. He wasn't tired. He was afraid that if he said too much, she might see exactly what he felt and not feel the same. As they headed to their dormitories, Harry caught himself wishing he could walk her to her room without the awkward separation at the stairs. He watched her disappear behind the door, wondering if she ever thought about him the way he thought about her. Over the next week, the quiet moments between them became Harry's favorite part of the day. Whether it was studying in the library, passing each other in the corridors, or sharing a laugh at breakfast, he found himself looking forward to each encounter. Still, his feelings remained a secret, hidden beneath everyday conversations and careful glances. One afternoon, after charms, Harry and Hermione ended up walking back to the common room together. The air outside was crisp, and a light snowfall had begun, dusting the grounds in white. Hermione tilted her face upward to catch the flakes, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Harry watched her for a second longer than he should have, then quickly looked away when she turned toward him. "Are you going to Hogsmeade this weekend?" she asked. "I was thinking about it," Harry said. "Why?" "I thought it might be nice to go together," she said, her tone casual but her smile warm. The idea made his heart race, though he kept his reply steady. "Yeah, I'd like that." They didn't make it a formal arrangement. Hermione seemed to assume it was just as friends. But for Harry, it was the closest thing yet to spending real time with her outside of schoolwork and Quidditch. That Saturday, they wandered through Hogsmeade, visiting shops and stopping for hot chocolate at the Three Broomsticks. Snow continued to fall outside, softening the edges of the world, and Harry thought he could live in that moment forever. Hermione laughed at something he said, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and Harry realized he would do almost anything to keep that smile on her face. But as they left the warmth of the pub and walked back toward the castle, Harry knew that sooner or later, he would have to decide whether to keep his feelings hidden or find the courage to tell her. And with every day that passed, the choice seemed harder. The thought stayed with him long after they returned to Gryffindor Tower, and that night, lying in bed, he made himself a quiet promise. He wouldn't let the year end without her knowing the truth. The Gryffindor common room was unusually quiet that evening, the fire crackling softly in the hearth while most students buried themselves in homework. Harry sat in his favorite armchair by the window, quill in hand, pretending to work on his transfiguration essay. In reality, his eyes kept drifting toward the couch where Hermione sat, a pile of books surrounding her like a fortress. She was reading so intently, lips moving ever so slightly as she absorbed the text, that she hadn't noticed him watching her for the past 10 minutes. Ron was nowhere to be seen, off in the kitchens with Seamus and Dean, leaving Harry and Hermione in a rare pocket of uninterrupted quiet. Every time she turned a page, Harry's heart seemed to beat a little faster. He tried to focus on his essay, scratching down a few half-thought sentences, but all he could think about was how much he wanted to sit beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her shoulder. Finally, gathering what little courage he had, Harry stood and walked over to her. She looked up in mild surprise as his shadow fell over her book. "Need a break?" he asked, gesturing toward the window where the night sky was dotted with stars. Hermione glanced from her open book to the view outside. "Maybe just for a minute. My eyes are starting to cross from reading so much." She smiled faintly and set the book aside. They moved to the window together, leaning on the sill as they looked out at the darkened grounds. The moonlight silvered the black lake, casting ripples of light across its surface. Harry found himself speaking without thinking. "It's nice when it's just us like this," he said quietly. Hermione turned to look at him, her expression curious. "Just us," she repeated. Harry's cheeks burned, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. "Yeah. No Ron barging in, no noise, no homework pressure. Just peaceful." Hermione's eyes softened. "I suppose it is peaceful," she agreed. "We hardly ever get moments like these." There was a beat of silence. Harry wanted to say more, to tell her exactly why he liked these moments, but the words caught in his throat. Hermione, perhaps sensing his hesitation, gave him a small, reassuring smile before looking back at the view. "You know," she began, "you've seemed different lately. Quieter, but in a thoughtful way." Harry tensed slightly. "Different how?" She tilted her head. "It's hard to explain. You seem more attentive, maybe. Like you're seeing things you didn't before." Harry swallowed hard, realizing she was closer to the truth than she probably knew. Maybe I am, he admitted. Hermione's smile lingered, but she didn't press him. Instead, they stood in comfortable silence, the quiet punctuated only by the soft pop of the fire in the background. When she eventually returned to her books, Harry followed her and sat beside her instead of going back to his armchair. They didn't talk much, but he found himself leaning just slightly closer, drawn in by her quiet concentration. Every now and then she would point out something interesting from her reading, and he would listen as though it were the most important thing in the world. An hour later, Ron finally burst into the common room, loud and full of energy, breaking the calm. Hermione glanced up in mild annoyance, while Harry quietly wished the night could have lasted a little longer. But even as the moment ended, he knew something had shifted. For the first time, he had allowed himself to step a little closer, to spend time with her not as a friend in a group, but as someone who wanted to know her in a way no one else did. And he was certain he wanted more nights like this. That certainty stayed with him long after he went to bed, his mind replaying every smile, every glance, every moment until he finally drifted into dreams filled with moonlight and her laughter. Snow blanketed the grounds of Hogwarts in a thick, glittering sheet as the great hall buzzed with excitement. The annual winter feast was always a grand event, but this year it seemed even more magical. Icicles dangled from the enchanted ceiling, shimmering in the candlelight, and frost patterned the windows like intricate lace. Long tables were adorned with steaming platters of food, from roasted meats to golden treacle tarts. Laughter echoed from all corners of the room as students shared stories, swapped sweets, and marveled at the enchanted decorations. Harry sat beside Hermione at the Gryffindor table, his eyes occasionally straying toward her without meaning to. She was wearing a deep burgundy jumper with a soft scarf wrapped around her neck, her hair slightly frizzier from the winter air. Every time she smiled, something in Harry's chest tightened. He had spent the past few weeks telling himself that his feelings would fade, that it was probably just a passing crush. But the more he was around her, the more certain he became that it was something far deeper. Across the table, Ron was piling his plate with roast potatoes, seemingly oblivious to Harry's internal turmoil. In fact, Ron was more focused on convincing Seamus that the Chudley Cannons would win their next match than on anything else. Harry was grateful for the distraction it provided, because it meant no one noticed how his attention lingered on Hermione. Hermione, however, seemed to pick up on Harry's occasional glances. At one point, she turned toward him and gave a warm smile. "You're quieter than usual tonight, Harry. Everything all right?" she asked, her tone laced with genuine concern. Harry blinked, startled. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just enjoying the evening," he replied quickly, forcing a smile of his own. But as she turned back to talk with Ginny, Harry found himself watching the way her hands moved animatedly as she spoke, how her laughter seemed to make the whole space brighter. The music began soon after, a soft melody from a group of enchanted instruments in the corner of the hall. Students began to stand and dance in small groups. Ron, after finishing his third helping of treacle tart, elbowed Harry. "Fancy a dance?" he joked, clearly not serious. Harry chuckled but shook his head. Instead, he found himself glancing toward Hermione, who was talking with Ginny and Neville near the end of the table. She caught his eye, tilting her head as though to silently ask if he wanted to join them on the dance floor. Harry hesitated for a moment, nerves knotting in his stomach, but before he could decide, someone else approached her. It was a Ravenclaw boy from their year named Michael Corner. He asked Hermione something, and she gave a polite nod before following him toward the middle of the hall. Harry's chest tightened unexpectedly as he watched her dance. She smiled at Michael, though it was more out of politeness than anything else, but Harry still felt the faint sting of jealousy. Ron noticed Harry's gaze and raised an eyebrow. "You all right, mate? You've been staring holes in the back of Corner's head." Harry quickly looked away. "Just tired," he muttered, trying to sound casual. But his mind was far from relaxed. Every twirl Hermione made, every laugh she gave to something Michael said, felt like a quiet ache. Eventually, the song ended, and Hermione returned to her seat. She looked a little flushed from the dancing and reached for a goblet of pumpkin juice. "Did you dance at all?" she asked Harry. Harry shook his head with a faint grin. "Not really my thing." Hermione gave him a thoughtful look but didn't push. Instead, She began telling him about the latest book she was reading over the holidays, her eyes lighting up with passion. Harry listened intently, though he was more focused on her expressions than her words. As the feast drew to a close, Dumbledore stood to give his usual cheerful speech, wishing everyone a joyful winter break. Harry barely heard the words, his thoughts wrapped up in Hermione. Later, as they walked back to the common room, snow began to fall again outside the castle windows. Hermione walked beside him, her scarf brushing against his arm. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she murmured, glancing out at the snowflakes drifting in the moonlight. Harry nodded, but his eyes were on her, not the snow. "Yeah, it really is." Hermione smiled faintly, clearly unaware of the depth behind his words. But Harry knew that this feeling wasn't going away. If anything, it was growing stronger with every passing day. By the time they reached the common room, the fire crackled warmly, and the atmosphere felt cozy. Hermione sat down to read by the fire, and Harry took the seat across from her, content just to watch her in the soft glow of the flames. Somewhere deep inside, he made a silent promise to himself. One day, he'd tell her. Maybe not soon, maybe not even this year. But one day. And when he did, he hoped she would see him the same way he saw her. The Gryffindor common room was nearly empty, the fire casting a warm glow over the worn armchairs and thick carpets. Outside, snow fell gently against the windows, blanketing the castle in winter stillness. Harry sat near the fire, pretending to read a book, though his eyes hadn't moved from the same paragraph for several minutes. He was waiting. Hermione had gone upstairs to put away her books after dinner, and Harry knew she would come back down soon. She always did. Night was her favorite time to study quietly, away from the bustling noise of the day. Sure enough, footsteps approached on the staircase, and Hermione appeared, her arms full of parchment and a quill tucked behind her ear. She looked tired but still managed a small smile when she saw him. "You're up late," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "I could say the same about you," Harry replied with a faint grin. "I have to finish my transfiguration notes before McGonagall's next class," Hermione said, already arranging her work on the table. "If I don't, I'll forget the finer points." Harry hesitated, glancing at her as she bent over her parchment. The soft light of the fire made her hair shine, and the way her brow furrowed slightly when she concentrated tugged at something inside him. He had been holding this in for weeks now, and every day it felt harder to keep it to himself. "Hermione," he said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the nervous edge in his voice. "MHM," she hummed, not looking up. "I was thinking about the Yule Ball," he started. That made her pause, quill hovering above the parchment. She looked at him curiously. "What about it?" He swallowed, his heart thudding loudly. "I should have asked you back then. I didn't, and I regret it." Hermione blinked, her lips parting slightly as if caught off guard. "Harry, you had other things on your mind at the time. You were worried about the tournament." "That's not the real reason," Harry admitted quietly. "I didn't ask because I didn't know how to tell you that I like you." Hermione's eyes softened, but she didn't speak right away. Harry's stomach twisted, wondering if he had just ruined everything between them. She placed her quill down and leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You like me?" she asked, her voice calm, almost unreadable. Harry nodded, unable to meet her gaze for more than a second. "Yeah. I have for a while now. I just didn't think you'd feel the same, and I didn't want to risk our friendship." The fire crackled between them, the silence stretching. Hermione finally let out a slow breath. "Harry, you're one of my best friends. I care about you a lot. But it's a lot to take in." Harry's chest tightened, a mixture of hope and dread swirling inside him. "I get it. You don't have to say anything now. I just needed you to know." Hermione gave a small nod, her eyes searching his face as though she was trying to read every thought behind his words. "All right. But Harry, no matter what, we'll always be friends." Harry forced a small smile, though the words stung more than he expected. "Yeah, always." They returned to their books after that, though neither of them really read a word. The air between them felt different now, heavier, uncertain, and yet somehow filled with possibility. What Harry didn't notice was the faint smile Hermione hid behind her parchment when he wasn't looking. The Gryffindor common room was unusually quiet that evening. Most students had either gone to bed, or were still in the library preparing for the upcoming exams. Harry sat near the fire, staring into the flickering flames, lost in thought. He had been distracted all day, unable to focus on anything other than the memory of Hermione smiling at him in the library the previous night. It had been a simple moment, but for Harry, it had carried a weight he could not shake. Hermione entered the room, holding a stack of books. She looked tired but determined, her hair slightly frizzier than usual. She spotted Harry and made her way toward him, setting her books on the table nearby. "You have been awfully quiet lately, Harry," she said, taking a seat opposite him. "Is something bothering you?" Harry hesitated, searching for a safe answer. "No, just thinking about all the work we have to do before exams." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "That is not like you. You usually wait until the last minute to worry about schoolwork." Harry smiled faintly. "True, but maybe I am learning from you." She chuckled softly, leaning back in her chair. "I suppose that would not be such a bad thing." Ron entered the common room just then, looking annoyed. "There you two are," he said. "I have been looking everywhere. Are we still going over the Quidditch strategy tonight?" Harry glanced at Hermione before answering. "I think I will pass tonight, Ron. I am a bit tired." Ron frowned but shrugged. "Suit yourself. I will talk to the team without you then." When Ron left, the common room fell into a comfortable silence again. Hermione pulled one of her books toward her, flipping through the pages. Harry found himself watching her every movement, from the way her fingers turned the pages to the way her brow furrowed when she concentrated. She must have noticed his gaze because she looked up after a moment. "What is it, Harry?" He quickly looked away. "Nothing, just wondering how you managed to keep so focused all the time." Hermione smiled softly. "You just have to care about what you are doing. That makes all the difference." They stayed there for a while, Hermione reading and Harry simply enjoying her presence. At one point, her head dropped slightly, and Harry realized she had fallen asleep with her book still open. He hesitated before gently taking the book from her hands and setting it on the table. He considered waking her, but instead he grabbed a blanket from the back of the sofa and draped it over her shoulders. For a few minutes, he simply sat there, watching her breathe, feeling the warmth of the fire and the quiet peace of the moment. Harry did not know if he would ever have the courage to tell her how he felt, but in moments like this, he thought maybe just being near her was enough. Still, deep down, a part of him hoped that one day she might look at him the way he looked at her. The sound of footsteps made Harry turn. Ginny was walking toward him with a knowing look on her face. She glanced at the sleeping Hermione, then back at Harry and smirked slightly. "You know you are not as subtle as you think," she whispered. Harry's cheeks flushed. "I do not know what you are talking about." Ginny tilted her head. "Sure you do. Just be careful, Harry. If you wait too long, someone else might notice her first." Her words lingered in his mind long after she had gone upstairs. Harry glanced back at Hermione and felt a wave of determination rise within him. Ginny was right. If he wanted Hermione to know how he felt, he could not hide it forever. As the fire burned lower, Harry stayed in his seat, keeping quiet watch over his sleeping friend. The castle around them was filled with shadows and whispers, but in that moment, the only thing Harry cared about was the girl sleeping peacefully beside him, and the hope that one day, she might be more than just his best friend. The great hall buzzed with noise during breakfast, but Harry found himself staring blankly at the parchment before him. His porridge had gone cold, untouched. Hermione sat beside him, meticulously annotating her arithmancy notes, her quills scratching softly. Every so often, she'd glance up, her expression neutral, yet Harry noticed her eyes lingered for just a second longer than necessary. Ron sat across from them, aggressively buttering his toast, muttering under his breath. Harry didn't need to hear the words to know they weren't friendly. Ever since the Quidditch match, Ron's irritation seemed to have grown, and his attitude toward Hermione had shifted from annoyance to outright hostility. When Hermione leaned over to ask Harry a question about their defense against the dark arts essay, Ron slammed his goblet onto the table. "Do you two ever stop talking?" he said loudly enough for several nearby students to turn their heads. Hermione froze mid-sentence, eyes narrowing. "Is there a problem, Ron?" "Yeah, actually there is," Ron replied, his tone sharp. "You're spending so much time together, it's like you've forgotten you have other friends." Harry stiffened. "That's not fair, Ron." "What's not fair is being treated like I'm invisible," Ron shot back before shoving his plate away and storming out of the hall. Hermione exhaled slowly, clearly trying to keep her composure. "Ignore him," she muttered, returning to her notes, though the tension in her grip on the quill gave her away. Classes that day felt longer than usual. In potions, Harry found himself glancing at Hermione more often than he should have. She was focused as always, her hair falling forward in soft curls as she carefully measured out ingredients. Professor Snape's snide comments barely fazed her. But during lunch, when Harry tried to sit beside her again, Ron plopped down first, wedging himself between them with a forced grin. "Thought I'd join you too. Been missing out on all the fun, haven't I?" His words dripped with sarcasm. Hermione didn't respond, choosing instead to immerse herself in her book. Harry clenched his jaw, wishing Ron would just stop. That evening in the common room, Hermione sat by the fire, reading. Harry hesitated before approaching. She looked up as he stood before her, and for a moment neither spoke. Then she smiled faintly. "You're avoiding him too, aren't you?" Harry chuckled softly, sitting down. "Only because I'm not in the mood for another argument." They talked quietly, the rest of the room fading into the background. Harry caught himself watching the flicker of firelight in her eyes, wondering if she noticed the way he lingered on her every word. Little did he know, Hermione's heart was starting to beat just a little faster when Harry was near. And though she didn't admit it to herself yet, the change was beginning. The days after the Gryffindor victory against Ravenclaw were filled with an electric kind of energy. The common room still buzzed with retellings of Harry's last-minute seeker dive, and Hermione's voice was among the loudest cheering for him that night. But somewhere beneath that cheerful surface, Harry found himself drawn to her in quieter, more deliberate ways. He caught himself seeking her out in the library, not because he had an urgent essay to finish, but because he liked the way her eyes lit up when she explained something. Ron, meanwhile, seemed to have regained some of his earlier good spirits, but there was a new edge to the way he interacted with Harry and Hermione. He laughed with them, joined their study sessions, and still played chess with Harry, but he sometimes slipped in a sharp comment toward Hermione that made Harry tense. He didn't like it, and he knew Hermione noticed, too. One afternoon, as they sat in the library with books spread in a chaotic arrangement between them, Harry leaned closer than necessary to look over Hermione's shoulder at her notes. She was scribbling something about protective charms, her handwriting neat yet hurried. She glanced at him, eyebrow raised. "You could just ask instead of hovering," she said with a small smile. "Hovering? I was just observing," Harry replied, trying to hide the nervous twist in his stomach. "You've been observing a lot lately," she teased, but there was a softness in her tone that made him think she wasn't annoyed. Before he could answer, Madame Pants appeared, giving them both a sharp look for whispering too much. They exchanged a suppressed laugh, their knees brushing under the table. Harry didn't move his away, and she didn't either. Later that week, McGonagall announced a small inter-house academic competition, pairing students from different houses together to solve magical riddles and challenges. Harry had expected Hermione to be paired with someone from Ravenclaw, but when the names were read, he found himself matched with her. His first reaction was a rush of excitement, quickly followed by a flicker of guilt. Ron had been paired with a Slytherin student and didn't seem thrilled about it. They spent the next few evenings preparing, Hermione pulling him into long discussions about possible puzzle solutions and magical theory. Harry found that he didn't mind the extra hours in the library. It gave him an excuse to spend time just with her. The night before the competition, they sat by the fireplace, parchments scattered around them. Hermione yawned, leaning back and rubbing her eyes. "I think we've got a good chance tomorrow," she murmured. Harry smiled. "With you on my team, we can't lose." She looked at him then, her gaze lingering for just a heartbeat too long. "That's sweet, Harry," she said softly, before turning back to her notes. Harry's heart was still racing when Ron plopped down beside them, clearly in a sour mood. "Bet you two are loving this little setup," he muttered. Hermione stiffened, but before she could respond, Harry said firmly, "We're just preparing, Ron." Ron didn't answer, but his expression spoke volumes. Harry knew things between them were far from settled, and he suspected tomorrow's competition might make things even more complicated. The great hall sparkled with frost charms and floating snowflakes, a constant reminder that the Yule Ball was only a few weeks away. Harry found himself unusually restless, watching students gossip in corners, whispering about who they hoped to attend with. Even in lessons, the talk of the ball seemed to creep in. Hermione, however, remained focused on her studies, scribbling down notes in potions while ignoring the constant chatter around her. It was after class when Ron brought up the subject. "So, who are you taking to the ball, Harry?" he asked casually, though his eyes flickered between Harry and Hermione. Harry hesitated, aware that his first instinct was to ask Hermione. She was clever, kind, and had been at his side through so much. But lately, he'd noticed his stomach twist in strange ways whenever she smiled at him. "I haven't decided," Harry replied, pretending to concentrate on his bag straps. "What about you?" Ron shrugged. "I'll probably wait. Don't see the rush." His tone was deliberately light, but Harry caught the flicker of tension. Hermione, walking just ahead of them, seemed oblivious, or perhaps she was pretending to be. Over the next few days, Harry found himself planning how he might ask her. But each time the words formed in his mind, he lost his nerve. He imagined her saying yes and the evening being perfect, but he also imagined her politely declining, perhaps mentioning someone else. The thought made his chest feel heavy. One evening in the library, Harry sat across from Hermione while she read through a thick book on ancient runes. The fire crackled nearby, and the dim light made the room feel warmer than usual. He kept glancing at her, wondering if he could bring himself to ask. She caught him looking once and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she asked with a faint smile. "Nothing," Harry muttered, though his heart was pounding. Hermione tilted her head slightly, as if sensing there was more he wanted to say, but she didn't press. Instead, she went back to reading, and the moment slipped away again. The next day, Ginny caught Harry outside the common room. "You're planning to ask Hermione, aren't you?" she said quietly, smirking at his startled expression. "You should, before someone else does." Harry frowned. "What do you mean, someone else?" Ginny shrugged. "Just saying, she's not exactly invisible. Plenty of people notice her." The idea unsettled him more than he expected. That evening, as the common room filled with laughter and chatter, Harry decided he had to act soon. The Yule Ball was getting closer, and he didn't want to risk losing his chance. But somewhere deep down, he also knew that asking her might change everything between them, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The following evening, Harry found himself wandering the dim corridors of Hogwarts, restless from the lingering tension between him and Hermione. He wasn't sure if she was avoiding him intentionally or if it was just his own paranoia, but her absence during dinner and the study group gnawed at him. He eventually made his way to the library, hoping to catch her in her usual corner. The library was quiet, with only the faint rustle of parchment and Madame Pance's sharp eyes darting between students. As Harry stepped inside, he spotted Hermione seated at a long wooden table, her head bent over a stack of books. Relief washed over him, but he hesitated. She wasn't alone. Draco Malfoy sat across from her, leaning forward with an almost uncharacteristic seriousness, whispering something she seemed to find genuinely intriguing. Harry's stomach twisted. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, that maybe they were just working on an assignment. But the way Draco's gaze lingered on her, and how Hermione gave a small, almost shy smile in response, made it impossible for him to look away. He ducked behind a nearby bookshelf, his pulse quickening, straining to hear their words. "You're better at this than half the professors," Draco said quietly, sliding a parchment toward her. "I don't know how you can make sense of this arithmancy nonsense." "It's not nonsense if you actually focus," Hermione replied, her tone teasing but warm. "And I've told you before, I don't mind helping." Harry clenched his fists, fighting the irrational urge to walk over and interrupt. He reminded himself that Hermione was allowed to speak to anyone she wanted, even Malfoy. Still, the way they seemed so at ease unsettled him. Suddenly, a faint movement caught Harry's eye. In the far shadowy corner of the library, something, or someone was watching them. A tall, hooded figure stood perfectly still between the shelves, its presence almost blending with the darkness. Harry's instincts screamed danger. He took a step forward, but in that instant, the figure vanished into thin air, as though it had never been there at all. Harry's mind raced. Had he imagined it? Or was someone truly spying on Hermione and Malfoy? And if so, why? He emerged from behind the shelf, unable to ignore his unease any longer. Hermione looked up in surprise at his sudden appearance. "Harry, what are you doing here?" she asked, blinking. "I was just looking for a book," he said, his voice tighter than intended. His eyes flicked briefly to Malfoy, who smirked faintly. Hermione frowned slightly, sensing something off, but Harry didn't elaborate. His thoughts were consumed by that shadow in the corner and the strange, almost possessive tension building inside him. Something was changing, and Harry couldn't shake the feeling it was only the beginning. The Christmas break brought with it a soft layer of snow that blanketed the castle grounds, making Hogwarts look like something out of a storybook. Hermione stood by the window in the common room, watching flakes swirl in the wind. She had been lost in her thoughts for the better part of the morning, thinking about Harry more than she wanted to admit. Every time she saw him smile or laugh with his friends, a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. Harry entered quietly, shaking the snow from his hair and scarf. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and when he spotted her, his lips curved into that easy smile she knew too well. "You've been in here all morning. I was starting to think you were avoiding the snow just to avoid me," he teased lightly. Hermione rolled her eyes, though there was a smile playing on her lips. "I'm not avoiding you. I just happen to enjoy staying warm and dry." Still, she moved aside so he could join her by the window. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them comfortable but charged with something unspoken. The common room was quiet except for the occasional pop from the fireplace. Harry shifted slightly, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. "You know, we haven't had a proper conversation in days. It's been all group talks and busy schedules. I kind of miss just talking to you." Her heart skipped at his words, but she forced herself to respond casually. "We're talking now, aren't we?" "Yes," he said with a small chuckle. "But I mean properly talking. Like before." He paused, his voice softening. "When it was just us, and you didn't feel like you had to hide anything." The words hit her harder than she expected. Did he sense that she'd been keeping things from him? She swallowed, choosing her next words carefully. "I haven't been hiding anything, Harry. Maybe just keeping certain thoughts to myself." Harry tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering in his green eyes. "Thoughts about what?" Hermione looked back out at the snow, her hands tightening around the edge of her sweater. "About how much things have changed lately. How different we've both become since we first came here. It's strange to think about." Harry's gaze lingered on her, searching for the meaning behind her words. "Different isn't always bad," he said quietly. Their eyes met then, and the world outside the window seemed to fade. There was a flicker of something in his expression, something Hermione couldn't fully name but felt deep in her chest. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps broke the moment. Ron entered, carrying a plate of gingerbread biscuits from the kitchen, and the spell between them shattered like thin ice. "There you two are. I've been looking everywhere. Want some?" Hermione stepped back, putting space between her and Harry as she took a biscuit. Harry didn't move right away. His gaze still lingered on her, as though he was reluctant to let the moment go. Later that evening, Hermione found herself in the library, the soft glow of candles casting warm light over the shelves. She was reading, but her mind was still on Harry. She thought of his words, the way he'd looked at her, and the feeling that had bloomed in her chest. It wasn't something she could explain, but it was something she couldn't ignore anymore. When she finally returned to the common room, she found Harry waiting by the fire, a book in his hands. He looked up as she approached, and there it was again, that unspoken understanding, fragile but undeniable. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. "Not really," he replied, closing the book. "I guess I was hoping you'd come back before I went upstairs." Hermione's lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. "Then I suppose I'm glad I didn't stay in the library any longer." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the firelight dancing between them. Neither said anything more, but they didn't need to. Something had shifted that day, and they both felt it. By the time she finally went upstairs, Hermione knew with absolute certainty that things between them would never quite be the same again. The cold of January seeped into every corner of Hogwarts, yet the castle's atmosphere seemed heavier than the winter air. Harry could not shake the image of Hermione standing with Draco in the library, the two of them talking in a way that felt too private. It gnawed at him, making his thoughts spiral into places he didn't want to visit. He had tried to bury himself in Quidditch practice and schoolwork, but neither distraction could pull his mind away from the growing tension between them. Hermione had noticed Harry's distant mood, but wasn't sure how to approach it. Her interactions with Draco had not been about secret feelings, but rather something else entirely, a mutual need to solve a problem that had unexpectedly drawn them together. Ever since the strange book had been uncovered in the library, the one with spells neither of them recognized, they had been meeting in secret to decipher its meaning. Hermione knew Harry would not approve, especially if Draco was involved, but the magic inside those pages was both ancient and dangerous. One evening, when the corridors were unusually quiet, Hermione slipped into the library's restricted section. Draco was already there, leaning against the table with the book open before him. His pale face was illuminated by candlelight, and he looked more serious than she'd ever seen him. "You're late, Granger," Draco said, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "I had to make sure no one followed me," she replied, setting her bag down and pulling out a stack of notes. "I think I've figured out part of the incantation, but it's not pleasant." Draco raised an eyebrow. Pleasant was never part of the deal. "What does it do?" Hermione hesitated before answering. "It seems to bind two magical cores together, permanently. Not in the way a marriage bond would, but in a way that would make them dependent on each other's magic. It's dangerous." Draco stared at her for a moment. "So why would someone like you be interested in learning this?" "Because," Hermione said firmly, "I think someone is trying to use it. And if we don't understand how it works, we won't be able to stop them." Meanwhile, Harry had been following his instincts, and they led him straight to the library that night. He walked softly down the aisle, just in time to hear Draco's voice. "Sounds to me like whoever tries it will be in for a world of pain. Unless they're doing it willingly." Harry stepped out from behind the shelf. "And what exactly are you two talking about?" Hermione froze, her mind racing for an explanation. Draco, however, didn't miss a beat. "Relax, Potter. We're not plotting your downfall. Granger here needed someone with a bit of subtlety to help her with a problem." Harry narrowed his eyes. "Subtlety isn't exactly the word I'd use for you, Malfoy." "Nevertheless," Draco said, closing the book with a soft thump, "you should know this. If someone's planning to use this kind of spell, it's going to cause chaos. And I don't like chaos unless I'm the one causing it." Harry glanced at Hermione, silently demanding the truth. She met his gaze with a mixture of defiance and pleading. "Harry, I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react like this. But this is bigger than house rivalries. If we don't figure this out, someone could end up bound to someone else's magic for life. And I think the person trying to make that happen is already in the castle." For a long moment, the three of them stood in tense silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Finally, Harry sighed. "Fine, but I'm in on this. If someone's going to be doing dangerous research, you're not leaving me out of it." Draco smirked slightly. "Looks like we've got ourselves an unlikely alliance, Potter." The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls as the three of them leaned over the book. Outside, the wind howled against the castle, but inside, an even more dangerous storm was beginning to form. The weeks after the Yule Ball carried an uneasy rhythm for Harry. The excitement and tension of that night hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened. Every time he saw Hermione across the Great Hall, whether bent over her notes or laughing quietly with Ginny, his chest tightened in a way that was becoming all too familiar. He told himself it was ridiculous to dwell on her so much, yet his thoughts always found their way back to her. The castle buzzed with talk about the second task, and Harry knew he should be focusing on that. The first task had been nerve-wracking enough, and he could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. But Hermione seemed just as determined to help as she had before, pulling him aside between classes to go over potential spells and theories. Their study sessions had become a strange mix of productive and distracting. Harry would start off determined to listen, but then he'd find himself watching her lips move as she explained a charm, or the way her hair caught the flickering light from the torches. One late evening in the library, Hermione pushed a heavy book across the table toward him. "This could be useful," she said, pointing to a section about underwater breathing charms. "It's complicated, but if you start practicing now..." Harry smirked. You're acting like you expect me to be underwater for hours." She rolled her eyes, though a faint smile tugged at her lips. "You never know what the task will throw at you. Preparation is everything." The warmth in her voice made it hard for him to focus on the actual words. He nodded, pretending to study the page, though he could feel her watching him. When he finally glanced up, her expression softened, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then she broke the silence, busying herself with gathering her notes. As February crept closer, Harry found himself becoming more protective of her without meaning to. When Malfoy and his friends made a snide comment about Hermione's dedication to helping Harry, Harry's temper flared instantly. He stepped toward them before he could stop himself, only for Hermione to place a hand on his arm and whisper, "They're not worth it." That touch stayed with him for the rest of the day. On the morning of the second task, the frozen surface of the Black Lake shimmered under a pale winter sun. The stands were filled with students wrapped in scarves and cloaks, their breath visible in the crisp air. Harry's heart raced, not only because of the task, but because he knew Hermione would be watching. She had squeezed his hand firmly before he headed toward the shore, her encouragement steadying him more than anything else. When the whistle blew, Harry plunged into the icy water. The gillyweed worked quickly, and soon he was gliding through the depths, searching for the hostages. The eerie green light and strange creatures lurking in the shadows made it easy to forget the cheering crowd above. Then he saw them, 4 figures tied to the lakebed. And there among them was Hermione. For a split second, panic shot through him. He had expected Ron, not her. The thought of leaving her behind, even knowing it was part of the task, made his chest tighten. He freed Ron first, but couldn't bring himself to leave Hermione until the merpeople's spears urged him away. The swim back felt longer than it should have, his thoughts heavy with worry. When the task ended and Hermione was brought safely to shore, she rushed to him without hesitation. "You did brilliantly," she said, her voice a mixture of pride and concern. She didn't seem to notice how tightly she hugged him, or maybe she didn't care. Harry felt the world around them fade for that brief moment, the cold and noise replaced by the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his. And in that instant, he knew that no matter how dangerous things became, his feelings for her weren't going anywhere. The great hall was buzzing with an energy that felt strangely unfamiliar. It was not the usual excitement over Quidditch, nor was it the tension of looming exams. This was something subtler, woven into glances and half-smiles exchanged across tables. Harry found his eyes straying toward Hermione more often than he realized, each time feeling a strange pull in his chest. Ron, seated next to him, was busy shoveling shepherd's pie into his mouth, completely oblivious. Hermione, on the other hand, seemed distracted in a way Harry could not quite read. She had her books with her, of course, but instead of reading, she absent-mindedly traced the rim of her goblet with her finger. When her gaze met Harry's, there was a pause, a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, before she looked away. Harry pretended to be interested in his mashed potatoes, but the warmth in his face gave him away. Later that evening, Harry found himself alone in the common room. Most students had gone to bed, and the crackling of the fireplace filled the quiet. He did not expect Hermione to join him, but a few minutes later, she appeared, clutching a book and a mug of tea. Without asking, she sat beside him, her legs tucked under her. "You've been quiet lately," she said, studying him with those sharp, knowing eyes of hers. "Something on your mind?" Harry hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, how he felt, how it seemed to be growing stronger each day, but his throat tightened. "Just thinking about a lot of things," he said vaguely. Hermione tilted her head, as though she could see right through him. "You're not usually this vague." "Well, unless it's about homework," she teased lightly. He chuckled, but there was no escaping the tension between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The firelight danced across her hair, making the brown strands glimmer like gold, and Harry caught himself staring again. The quiet was broken when the portrait hole swung open and Ron stumbled in, yawning. He spotted the two of them on the couch and raised an eyebrow. "Late-night study session?" he asked, though there was a slight edge to his tone. Hermione straightened, holding up her book as if to prove his assumption right. "Yes, something like that," she said quickly. Ron gave a short nod, but his eyes lingered on them for a moment before he muttered a good night and headed up the stairs. The second he was gone, the air between Harry and Hermione shifted again, warmer but more cautious. Hermione glanced at him, her voice softer now. "We should probably get some sleep too." Harry nodded, though part of him wanted to stay there forever, just sitting beside her. As she stood to leave, her hand brushed against his. It was the briefest touch, but it sent a spark through him. She hesitated, met his eyes for a heartbeat longer than usual, and then turned toward the girls' dormitory without another word. Harry sat there for a long while after she was gone, the fire slowly dying, his thoughts tangled in questions he was not ready to answer. The next morning, Harry woke to a thin stream of light filtering through the curtains of his dormitory. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, feeling the weight of the previous night's conversation with Hermione still pressing on his mind. She had been so quiet after revealing how deeply Ron's constant meddling was affecting her. Harry knew he couldn't just let things stay as they were. Something had to change. At breakfast, Hermione was seated at the end of the table, her plate barely touched. Harry slid into the seat beside her without saying a word at first. She glanced up briefly, giving him a faint smile, then returned to staring at her untouched toast. "I'm fine, Harry," she said softly, though her voice carried no conviction. "You're not," Harry replied. "And I'm not going to pretend I don't notice." He hesitated, then added, "We should talk after class, somewhere private." Hermione's eyes flickered with curiosity, but she simply nodded. Later that day, they met in the library, weaving through rows of towering shelves until they reached a small, dim corner far from Madame Pance's watchful eyes. Harry sat opposite her at a narrow table, the faint scent of parchment and dust surrounding them. "There's something I've been thinking," Harry began. "Ron isn't going to stop interfering unless we give him a reason to." Hermione's brow furrowed. "You mean confront him?" "Not exactly," Harry said. "I mean showing him that no matter what he says or does, it won't change how we treat each other. If we stop reacting to him, he'll lose the satisfaction of getting in the way." Hermione considered his words carefully. "That's logical. But you know Ron, he won't give up easily. And he'll probably make a scene." Harry leaned forward. "Then we let him. But we don't engage. We make it clear, without saying it, that his opinion isn't important to us." Hermione studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened. "It's strange," she admitted. "I've always thought of you as the brave one in the middle of danger. But this is a different kind of bravery." Harry smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of watching you get hurt by someone who's supposed to be our friend." The moment lingered between them, a quiet understanding forming. Hermione reached into her bag, pulling out a small, worn notebook. She opened it to a page covered in her neat handwriting. "I started writing down spells that could help us in tight spots, not just against danger, but for, well, more personal situations." Harry's eyes widened slightly as she slid the notebook toward him. He read a few of the notes: quick silencing charms, discreet protective wards, even a subtle spell to make one's presence less noticeable in a crowd. "This is brilliant," he said. "We could use these." Hermione's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Then we'll be ready. For anything." Neither of them noticed the shadow that passed briefly at the end of the aisle. Someone had been watching. The corridors of Hogwarts were quiet after dinner, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows against the stone walls. Harry lingered outside the great hall, scanning the crowd for Hermione. He finally spotted her, walking with Ginny toward the library, her laughter carrying lightly through the air. It was a sound that made his heart leap, though he tried to steady himself. Ron brushed past Harry without a glance, muttering something under his breath. Harry knew the tension between them hadn't eased. If anything, it was sharpening with each day. Deciding not to approach Hermione while Ginny was there, Harry turned and started toward the Gryffindor common room. The castle felt different tonight, quieter, almost watchful. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard footsteps echoing behind him. He turned to see Luna Lovegood, her expression distant, yet oddly knowing. She walked up beside him without a word, keeping pace. "You're thinking about her again," Luna said softly. Harry blinked in surprise but didn't deny it. She smiled faintly, as if she'd read his mind completely. "Feelings have a way of changing the way we see the world. Just don't lose yourself in them." Her words were cryptic, yet they lingered with him long after she had drifted away down another corridor. Later that night, Harry found himself restless. He left the common room and wandered the dim hallways. When he passed the library, he saw Hermione still inside, her head bent over a stack of books, quill moving furiously. He hesitated at the door, torn between going in and leaving her to study. But before he could decide, he heard voices further down the corridor. Peering into the shadows, he caught sight of Draco Malfoy speaking with someone Harry couldn't immediately identify. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Harry stepped closer, keeping in the dark. The other figure finally stepped into the light. It was a Slytherin girl he vaguely recognized from the year above. She handed Draco a folded piece of parchment, and his face tightened. Harry's mind raced. He didn't know what the note contained, but Draco's expression suggested it wasn't something ordinary. When Draco walked off quickly in the opposite direction, Harry considered following, but his eyes drifted back to the library where Hermione was. Something in him decided she was more important tonight. He walked in quietly, and Hermione looked up, surprised but not displeased. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Harry smiled faintly. "Something like that. Thought I'd keep you company." She hesitated only a moment before nodding, and he sat beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of quills on parchment filling the air. But every now and then, Harry found himself watching her instead of reading, memorizing the way her brow furrowed in concentration. Outside, the castle seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next turn in their story. The warmth of spring had begun to creep into the castle, melting away the last traces of winter. Flowers bloomed in the courtyards, their scents wafting through the open windows, and the lake shimmered under the gentle sunlight. Harry and Hermione had found a quiet corner near the library, away from the crowded tables, where the soft rustling of pages was the only sound. They were supposed to be working on their transfiguration essays, but Harry's eyes kept drifting to Hermione instead of the parchment. She had her head bent over the book, her curls falling forward like a curtain, and she occasionally tucked them behind her ear without looking up. Harry was trying to memorize the exact curve of her smile whenever she muttered to herself while reading, but she caught him staring. "What?" she asked, her voice soft but amused. Harry quickly shook his head. "Nothing, just wondering how you always manage to remember everything. It's like your brain never takes a break." Hermione smirked, tilting her head. "That's because I actually study, Harry." He chuckled, but there was something in his expression she didn't quite miss, an unspoken thought lingering in his eyes. She let it go for now, though part of her was beginning to notice these small moments more often. Their peaceful study time was interrupted when Ron appeared, looking annoyed. He dropped into the seat opposite them without asking. "You two hiding again? No wonder I can never find you." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "We're not hiding, Ron. We're studying. You could try it sometime." Ron ignored her and turned to Harry. "Come on, mate. I was going to head down to the pitch for a quick practice." "You're coming, right?" Harry hesitated. Normally, he would have agreed instantly, but today, with Hermione sitting across from him and the warm sunlight spilling across the table, leaving felt wrong. "Maybe later," he said. Ron's eyes flicked between them, his jaw tightening. "Right. Later." He stood abruptly and left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Hermione sighed. "He's been acting odd lately." Harry shrugged, though his stomach twisted with guilt. "Yeah, probably just tired." But Ron's mood wasn't the only thing weighing on Harry's mind. That night, as the castle quieted and shadows stretched along the walls, Harry found himself wandering the corridors. He had been restless for days, his thoughts drifting to Hermione more than they should. As he passed the empty defense against the dark arts classroom, he heard voices. Peering in, he saw Professor McGonagall speaking to Professor Dumbledore in hushed tones. The words danger, Voldemort, and Hermione slipped into the air, sharp enough to freeze Harry in place. He leaned closer, heart pounding. "Her intelligence makes her a target," McGonagall said gravely. "If they suspect she knows something." Dumbledore's gaze was solemn. "We must ensure she is protected, even if she does not realize the threat." Harry's breath caught. He stepped back, his mind spinning. The thought of Hermione in danger ignited something fierce inside him. Whatever this was, he wouldn't let it happen. Not to her. The next morning, Hermione noticed Harry was quieter than usual at breakfast. She asked him if something was wrong, but he simply gave her a reassuring smile and shook his head. Deep down, though, Harry had already made a silent promise. He would protect her at all costs, even if it meant keeping secrets of his own. The next morning brought with it a low, heavy fog that wrapped the castle in an eerie stillness. Breakfast in the Great Hall was unusually quiet for a Saturday, with students speaking in hushed tones as if the mist outside had seeped into their spirits. Hermione sat between Harry and Ron, her mind restless. She had barely slept after what she overheard between Dumbledore and McGonagall. The words still replayed in her head, unsettling and urgent. Harry noticed her distracted expression and lowered his voice. "You're still thinking about what you heard last night, aren't you?" Hermione hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Yes. Dumbledore mentioned something hidden in the castle. Something dangerous. And McGonagall said it was getting harder to protect it." Ron raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous? Like cursed broom dangerous, or—" "You know who dangerous?" Hermione's lips tightened. "I don't know. But I intend to find out." Before they could say more, Neville approached their table holding a folded piece of parchment. He looked both nervous and embarrassed. This was, slipped under the common room door this morning. It has your names on it." Harry took the parchment and unfolded it. The writing was rushed and uneven. "Meet me by the West Wing at midnight. Come alone. Tell no one." Ron frowned. "That's not suspicious at all." Hermione stared at the note, the corners of her mind already racing. The West Wing was mostly abandoned, sealed off after a structural collapse decades ago. Few students ever went near it. "We should go," she said firmly. "If someone knows something about what I overheard, they might be reaching out in secret." Harry agreed, though he felt a coil of unease in his stomach. Midnight in a deserted wing of the castle had all the makings of trouble. The day seemed to stretch endlessly. Classes were minimal, and even the library couldn't distract Hermione for long. When night finally came, the trio waited until the common room emptied before slipping out under the cover of Harry's invisibility cloak. The corridors were colder than usual, and their footsteps echoed faintly as they made their way to the West Wing. The air here was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The stones were cracked, the tapestries faded. They reached the base of a narrow, twisting staircase, its railing warped and splintered. "This is the place," Hermione whispered. "The note said to come alone, but since when do we follow rules that make no sense?" Halfway up the staircase, they heard a soft scraping sound above them. Harry froze. "Someone's here." They climbed cautiously, and as they reached the landing, a shadow darted across the wall and vanished into an archway. They followed, stepping into a dimly lit corridor lined with tall, boarded windows. At the far end stood a hooded figure, their face hidden. "You came," the figure said, their voice low and urgent. "Good. There isn't much time." "Who are you?" Harry demanded, pulling the cloak back so they were visible. The figure stepped forward just enough for the light to catch their face. It was a young woman, perhaps only a few years older than them, with sharp gray eyes. "My name isn't important," she said. "What matters is that there is something in this castle, something Dumbledore has sworn to keep hidden, that others are already searching for." Hermione's breath caught. "What is it?" The woman glanced toward the staircase as if expecting someone to appear. "It's called the Starbinder, an ancient magical artifact capable of binding a witch or wizard's power permanently. In the wrong hands, it could strip an entire generation of magic from existence." Ron gaped. "You're telling us that's here? In Hogwarts?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling slightly now. "And the protections around it are failing. That's why you three have been drawn into this, even if you don't realize it yet." A sudden crash echoed down the hallway, and the woman's eyes widened. "They've found me. Go now." She pulled a small pouch from her robe and tossed it to Harry. "Keep this safe. You'll know when to use it." Before they could ask more, she vanished down the corridor, her robes whipping around the corner. From the shadows behind them, a low, guttural growl began to rise. Ron's voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." But Harry already had his wand out, and Hermione's heart was hammering. Whatever was in the darkness was getting closer. The cold January winds howled outside, rattling the glass in the Gryffindor Tower windows. Harry sat by the fire, parchment spread before him, though his quill had long since stopped moving. He was lost in thought, replaying the unsettling events from the night before. The mysterious figure he and Hermione had glimpsed in the Forbidden Forest was no mere shadow. It had moved with a purpose, cloaked in something darker than night itself. Hermione approached quietly, a thick book clutched in her arms. She sat beside him without a word, her eyes scanning the firelight dancing on his face. She could see he was still troubled. "You're thinking about it again," she said softly, placing the book between them. "I've been researching all morning. There are only a handful of creatures or magical beings that could move like that, and even fewer that would dare lurk so close to Hogwarts." Harry leaned forward. "And," Hermione hesitated, "nothing matches exactly. But I found something about an ancient magic called veil walking. It's supposed to let a witch or wizard pass through shadows, almost like stepping between worlds. It's rare, dangerous, and mostly forgotten. If that's what we saw, then someone here knows more than they're telling." Before Harry could respond, the portrait hole swung open, and Ron stumbled in, cheeks red from the wind. "Blimey, it's freezing out there. You two look like you've been planning how to save the world again." Harry and Hermione exchanged a glance but said nothing. It wasn't that they didn't trust Ron. It was just that the strange tension between the three of them lately made confiding in him feel complicated. After Ron left for the dormitory, Hermione pulled a folded scrap of parchment from her pocket. "I found this wedged between two books in the restricted section. It's not in any handwriting I recognize, and I think it's a clue." Harry unfolded it and frowned. The parchment was covered in jagged ink strokes, symbols, circles, and a single phrase scrawled in messy script. "When the moon hides, the door will open." "The next new moon is in a week," Hermione whispered. "If this is connected to what we saw, then we have until then to figure it out." The rest of the evening passed in hushed whispers and exchanged theories, the fire slowly dying to embers. But long after Hermione had gone up to the girls' dormitory, Harry remained by the window, staring into the darkness beyond the castle grounds. Somewhere out there, in the shifting shadows of the Forbidden Forest, something or someone was waiting. And Harry knew deep down that when the moon hit again, everything would change. The Christmas holidays were just around the corner, and Hogwarts had transformed into a winter wonderland. Snow blanketed the grounds, the lake was frozen solid, and the castle glowed with golden warmth from its enchanted candles. Hermione, wrapped in a thick scarf, walked beside Harry through the courtyard. Their footsteps crunched in the snow, and their breath puffed out in little clouds in the frosty air. They had been spending more time together lately, but not in the obvious way that would draw too much attention. Harry had been careful, but his feelings for her were becoming harder to hide. They reached the library, where Hermione immediately began pulling books from the shelves. Harry smiled as he watched her eyes light up when she found a rare magical theory volume. She sat down, and he took the seat across from her. For a while, they simply read in silence, but Harry's mind wasn't on the book in front of him. He found himself watching the way her hair caught the light and the way she absent-mindedly bit her lip when she concentrated. The moment was interrupted when Ron appeared, his ears red from the cold and his mood clearly sour. "You two are spending an awful lot of time together lately," he said, trying to sound casual, but failing miserably. Hermione looked up with mild confusion. "We've always spent time together, Ron. It's nothing new." Harry kept his expression neutral, though he could feel the tension building. Ron didn't reply and instead sat down heavily, pretending to read. Over the next few days, Ron's subtle jealousy became more obvious. He made small comments during meals and seemed to watch Harry and Hermione closely whenever they were together. Harry tried to act normal, but deep down he feared Ron might start pushing them apart. At the same time, Harry noticed something different in Hermione's behavior too. She would occasionally glance at him in a way she hadn't before, longer, softer looks that made his heart race. One evening, after a particularly heavy snowfall, the trio went down to Hogsmeade for last-minute Christmas shopping. The village looked like something out of a fairy tale, with twinkling lights strung across rooftops and wreaths hanging on every door. They ducked into Honeydukes, where the air was sweet with the smell of chocolate. Hermione wandered off to browse while Harry followed a little behind. She stopped in front of a display of sugar quills, smiling as she picked one up. Harry saw an opportunity and, without thinking, bought it for her. When he handed it over, she looked surprised. "Harry, you didn't have to." I wanted to, he said softly, and for a moment their hands brushed. The warmth of the shop seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a quiet connection that neither of them acknowledged aloud. As they made their way back to the castle, snow falling gently around them, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that something between them was shifting. It wasn't just him anymore. Hermione seemed to sense it too, though neither of them dared put it into words. But Ron walked a few steps behind, his expression unreadable, and Harry knew the next term might bring more challenges than either of them expected. The great hall buzzed with the sound of clinking cutlery and soft murmurs, but Harry barely noticed any of it. He sat beside Hermione, his gaze drifting to her more often than it should. She seemed distracted, her spoon slowly stirring her porridge, though she wasn't eating. The flicker of candlelight caught in her hair, and Harry had to tear his eyes away before Ron, already suspicious, could make some sort of comment. "Harry," Hermione said quietly, almost as if she wasn't sure she wanted to speak. "Do you think people can change? Not just their behavior, but the way they think, the way they feel." Harry frowned, caught off guard by the question. "I suppose, yeah. I mean, I've seen people change. Some for the better, some for worse." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Why?" Hermione hesitated, her gaze sweeping across the hall before settling back on him. "It's just, I've been thinking a lot about choices lately, and how some things aren't as simple as right or wrong." That was an unusual thing for her to say. Normally, Hermione was all about rules and clear lines. But lately she'd seemed different. More thoughtful. Or maybe more conflicted. Harry wanted to press her about it, but before he could, Ron dropped into the seat across from them with a loud clatter of toast and bacon. "Blimey, you two look like you're planning a rescue mission or something," Ron said with a grin. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Hermione said quickly, straightening her posture. "Just talking about homework." Ron gave her a suspicious look, but then shrugged and dug into his breakfast. Harry tried to act normal, but he could feel Hermione's tension from inches away. Later that morning, the three of them made their way to the library. Ron wandered off toward the shelves on Quidditch history, likely in search of anything that might give Gryffindor an edge against Slytherin, while Hermione headed straight for a table in the far corner. Harry followed. She set down her books but didn't open them. Instead, she turned to him with a look that made his chest tighten. "Harry, I think something's going on. And I think you're going to be part of it." "What do you mean?" "Strange things have been happening lately," she said in a low voice. "Not dangerous, at least, not yet, but unusual. People are meeting in odd places at odd times. I've overheard conversations cut off the second I enter a room. And there are certain professors keeping an eye on students more closely than usual." Harry's brow furrowed. "You think this has to do with—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung between them. Hermione's voice dropped even lower. "I don't know yet. But if something is building, I don't want you to get blindsided." Harry opened his mouth to respond, but Ron came strolling back, clutching a book. "You two plotting again?" he said, plopping into the seat beside Hermione. "I swear, between the two of you, I never know what's going on." Hermione snapped her book open. "It's called studying, Ron. You should try it." The day passed in a blur of classes, but the conversation lingered in Harry's mind. That night, after most students had gone to bed, he found Hermione still in the common room, curled in an armchair with a book. The firelight painted warm shadows across her face. "You're still up?" he asked softly. She glanced up, smiling faintly. "I could say the same about you." He took the seat across from her. "About earlier, if something is happening, I want to know." "I can handle it." Her eyes searched his, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the castle had gone silent. "I know you can," she said. "That's what worries me." Neither of them spoke after that, but the quiet between them was different now, heavier, charged with unspoken things. Harry wasn't sure what was coming, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, he and Hermione were in it together. The castle had fallen into an uneasy silence, as though Hogwarts itself sensed the tension among its students. Harry sat in the Gryffindor common room late into the night, a half-finished essay forgotten in front of him. His quill lay across the parchment, ink slowly spreading in a small blot. His mind wasn't on homework. It hadn't been for weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Hermione's face, heard her voice, remembered the countless moments they had shared. Yet each of those memories was tangled with the weight of Ron's lingering resentment and the constant sense that their friendship stood on a fragile edge. Hermione had been keeping her distance since their awkward conversation by the lake. She still spoke to him in class, still partnered with him on assignments, but there was a careful restraint in her tone. She smiled less around him, and when she did, it never reached her eyes. The change unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The fat lady's portrait swung open suddenly, and Harry's head snapped up. Hermione stepped inside, clutching a thick stack of books. She froze when she saw him still awake. "You should be in bed," she said softly, though without the usual bossy warmth in her voice. Harry stood, shoving his books aside. "Hermione, can we talk?" She hesitated, glancing toward the stairs leading to the girls' dormitories, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but not here. Too many ears." They slipped out into the corridor, their footsteps echoing faintly against the stone. Hermione led him toward the library, which was dark and deserted at this hour. She lit a small lamp, casting a pool of warm light over one of the tables. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her books. Harry struggled for the right words. "I hate this," he admitted. "This thing between us. I feel like you're drifting away, and I don't know why." Her expression tightened, and she looked down at the table. "Harry, you know why. Ron hasn't forgiven you. Every time we're together, he acts like I've betrayed him. And it's not just Ron. People talk. They notice things." "Let them," Harry said, the words sharper than he intended. "I don't care what people say. He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair. "I can't lose you over this." Hermione's eyes met his, searching, conflicted. "You're not going to lose me," she said quietly. "But I don't want to make things worse. For you. For all of us." "Since when do we let fear decide what we do?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, her fingers tracing the edge of an open book. "It's not just fear," she said finally. "It's knowing that once we cross certain lines, there's no going back." The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Harry wanted to tell her exactly how he felt, to erase the space she had put between them. But before he could speak, a noise at the far end of the library made them both turn. From the shadows, a figure stepped into the lamplight. Ron. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hardness in his eyes. "I knew it," Ron said flatly. "Out here together in the middle of the night. Guess I was right all along." Hermione took a step toward him. "Ron, it's not what you—" "Save it," Ron interrupted, his voice low but cold. "You made your choice. Both of you." Before either of them could respond, he turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the darkness. Harry and Hermione stood frozen for a moment. The silence between them was no longer careful, it was fractured. And somewhere deep inside, Harry knew this wasn't the last confrontation they would face. But as Hermione extinguished the lamp and they walked back toward the common room in silence, he also knew something else. He wasn't going to let her go, no matter what it cost. Hermione walked briskly through the dimly lit corridor, her mind a storm of unanswered questions. The previous night's events still haunted her. Harry's strange late-night meeting in the courtyard with an unfamiliar cloaked figure. She hadn't dared to confront him then, not when the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long around them. But the image had rooted itself in her mind, refusing to let go. Harry was unusually quiet at breakfast. He barely touched his toast, keeping his eyes fixed on his pumpkin juice, as though it held the answers to some great mystery. Every so often he'd glance up, as if checking to see if Hermione was watching him. She was, though she tried to appear casual, engaging in polite conversation with Neville. Ron, oblivious to the tension between them, was enthusiastically talking about the upcoming Quidditch match. "We're going to flatten Slytherin this time," he declared, smacking the table with the palm of his hand. Harry gave him a distracted nod, while Hermione didn't respond at all, lost in thought. After breakfast, Hermione made up her mind. She waited until they had a moment alone in the library before leaning closer. "Harry," she began carefully, "is there something you're not telling me?" His shoulders tensed. "What do you mean?" "I saw you last night," she said, lowering her voice. "Outside by the courtyard. You weren't alone." Harry's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it looked like he might brush her off. But then, to her surprise, he sighed. "Hermione, it's complicated. You have to trust me on this." I do trust you, she insisted. But I can't help if I don't know what's going on. Harry glanced toward the nearest row of shelves, making sure no one else was around. That person I was talking to, they have information. About Voldemort. About what's coming. Hermione felt a chill run through her. Who are they? I can't say yet, Harry replied. It's too dangerous. If anyone finds out. Harry, keeping secrets from me is dangerous too, Hermione interrupted, her voice tight. If you're involved in something risky, I need to know so I can help you. He hesitated, then shook his head. Not yet, but I promise you'll know everything soon. Before Hermione could push further, Madame Pants appeared from behind a shelf, glaring at them for whispering. They both muttered apologies and turned back to their books, but Hermione's mind was elsewhere. Harry's reluctance wasn't just about protecting her. Something told her he was tangled in something far more complex than he was letting on. That night, Hermione decided she couldn't simply wait. She quietly left the common room after curfew, careful not to wake anyone. The castle was silent except for the distant dripping of water and the occasional creak of floorboards. Her heart pounded as she retraced the steps to the courtyard. The moon cast pale light across the stone floor, and Hermione crouched behind one of the pillars, scanning the shadows. She didn't have to wait long. Harry emerged from the far archway, his steps slow and deliberate. And he wasn't alone. The cloaked figure was back, speaking in a low tone. Hermione strained to hear, catching fragments. Time is running out. You have to be ready. He's closer than you think. Her stomach tightened. Whoever this person was, they weren't just an informant. They were preparing Harry for something. Something imminent. The figure glanced around suddenly, and Hermione froze. For a terrifying moment, she thought she'd been spotted. But Harry didn't look in her direction, and after another whispered exchange, the cloaked stranger disappeared into the shadows. Hermione stayed hidden until Harry left. Then she exhaled, her breath trembling. Whatever Harry was caught up in, it wasn't just dangerous, it could change everything. And now, she had a choice to make. Confront him again, or follow him until she learned the truth herself. She didn't know yet which she would choose. But one thing was certain. She was already in deeper than she'd intended. The library was almost empty that evening, save for the sound of a few quills scratching against parchment. Hermione sat at her usual corner table, her notes spread out in perfect order, though her eyes were fixed more on the same line of text than actually reading it. Across from her, Harry watched her quietly, pretending to review his own essay. He had noticed the change in her lately, the way she would go quiet around him, the way her gaze lingered on him for a moment too long before she quickly looked away. Ever since Ron had started openly ignoring them both, the air between the three friends had been thick with unspoken words. Harry had tried to speak to Ron, but each attempt had been met with cold one-word answers or Ron finding an excuse to leave. Hermione, meanwhile, kept busy with her studies, but even Harry could see the flicker of hurt in her expression when Ron walked by without acknowledging her. Harry set down his quill and leaned forward slightly. "Hermione," he said softly, careful not to draw Madame Pants's attention. "We need to talk about Ron." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Harry, I don't think Ron wants to talk to either of us right now. He's made his feelings quite clear." "That's the problem," Harry said, lowering his voice further. "He's angry, but he won't tell us why. And I think," he hesitated, choosing his words, "I think it has something to do with me and you." Hermione's brow furrowed. "Us? Harry, we haven't done anything." "I know," Harry replied quickly. "But Ron, he sees things differently. And I think he thinks there's something between us." Hermione froze, her quill resting in midair. Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked away. "That's ridiculous," she muttered, though her tone lacked its usual conviction. "We're friends. We've always been friends." Harry studied her for a moment, a small knot forming in his stomach. "Right. Friends." But the word felt heavier than it used to. Before Hermione could respond, the library door opened, and Ron stepped in. He glanced around until his eyes landed on them. For a brief second, Harry thought Ron might come over, but instead Ron's gaze hardened, and he turned toward the far corner of the library, sitting at a table alone. Hermione's fingers tightened around her quill. "I'm not sure how much longer I can take this, Harry," she whispered. It's exhausting pretending everything's fine when it isn't. Harry leaned in slightly, his voice steady. Then maybe we stop pretending. She looked at him, a flicker of something uncertain, maybe curiosity, maybe fear, in her eyes. What are you saying? Harry didn't get a chance to answer. The library door slammed open again, and Malfoy's drawl filled the air. Well, isn't this cozy? Potter and Granger hiding away, whispering secrets. He sauntered over, smirking. Where's Weasley? Oh, right, probably sulking somewhere. Hermione's jaw tightened. Go away, Malfoy. Touchy, Malfoy replied with a smirk. Maybe Weasley's right about you too. You do seem awfully close these days. Harry stood up, glaring. You'd better leave, Malfoy. Malfoy chuckled but backed off, clearly satisfied with planting his little seed of trouble. He strolled out, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind. Hermione sighed and rubbed her temples. This is exactly what I mean, Harry. People are starting to notice. And Ron, she trailed off, not finishing the thought. Harry reached across the table, his hand brushing hers for just a second before she pulled back. Hermione, he said quietly, maybe it's time we figure out what we actually are to each other, before someone else decides for us. Hermione looked at him, her eyes searching his, but she didn't reply. Instead, she gathered her books, whispering, Not here. Not now. And she left the library, leaving Harry alone with more questions than answers. He knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening between him, Hermione, and Ron, it was about to come to a breaking point. The Quidditch stadium was buzzing with energy, every seat filled, the banners of Gryffindor and Slytherin rippling in the breeze. The final match of the season had arrived, and though Harry had played many important games before, this one felt different. Perhaps it was because Hermione was in the stands, eyes trained on him with a mixture of nervousness and encouragement, or maybe it was the way Ron, sitting beside her, tried to appear supportive but clearly wrestled with conflicting emotions. As Harry mounted his firebolt, he caught sight of Draco on the other side of the pitch, his expression unreadable. Draco gave him a small nod, a silent challenge. They both knew this match was about more than just the Quidditch Cup. It was about pride, rivalry, and a hint of something deeper that had been building between their respective houses. The whistle blew, and the game erupted into motion. The chasers darted across the field in a blur of color, bludgers rocketed through the air, and the crowd roared with every near miss and scored goal. Harry darted high above, scanning for the telltale glint of gold, his mind half on the game and half on Hermione's voice in his head telling him to focus. Then he saw it, the snitch fluttering like a tiny sunbeam near the Slytherin stands. But Draco had seen it too. They dove simultaneously, the wind howling in their ears as they raced neck and neck. The ground rushed up to meet them, and neither showed any sign of pulling back. Just as Draco reached forward, a bludger, perfectly timed by one of the Gryffindor beaters, forced him to veer off course. Harry seized the moment, leaning forward, his fingers closing around the snitch in a triumphant grip. The Gryffindor stands exploded into cheers. Harry landed with a grin, the snitch still fluttering in his hand, but as he glanced toward Draco, he noticed something unusual. There was no bitterness, no anger. Instead, Draco gave him a curt nod of respect before walking off the pitch. Hermione ran down to meet Harry, throwing her arms around him without hesitation. For a moment, the world felt perfectly still. Ron, approaching from behind, hesitated. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something in his gaze suggested that while Gryffindor had won the match, a different kind of competition was still far from over. Harry felt it too. This wasn't just the end of a Quidditch game. It was the beginning of something that would test their friendships, their loyalties, and their hearts in ways they had never imagined. Harry and Hermione had barely settled into their seats in the common room when the fireplace roared to life. Professor McGonagall's head appeared in the emerald flames, her sharp eyes sweeping over the room until they landed on them. Potter, Granger. My office. Now. The urgency in her tone sent a ripple of unease through both of them. Hermione quickly set aside her book, and Harry got to his feet, exchanging a worried glance with her. They hurried out of the common room, the whispers of curious Gryffindors following them. When they arrived in McGonagall's office, the sight that greeted them made Hermione's stomach twist. Dumbledore was there, standing beside an unfamiliar witch with sharp, angular features and long, silvery hair. Her robes shimmered faintly, and her piercing gaze fixed on the two students like she was measuring their worth. "This is Celine Caro," Dumbledore said gravely. "She's here on behalf of the Ministry. She has a proposition for you both." Hermione's eyebrows knitted together. "For us?" she asked cautiously. Caro gave a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've both been observed for some time. Potter, your record against the dark arts is exceptional. Granger, your intellect and adaptability are remarkable. The Ministry believes you're capable of assisting in a mission that could turn the tide in our favor." Harry exchanged a quick glance with Hermione. "What kind of mission?" Caro stepped closer, her voice low but intense. "We've identified a suspected Death Eater stronghold. The location is warded, and entry is nearly impossible. But there's a loophole. The wards respond differently to those under the age of 17. With the right training, you could enter without alerting the enemy. Retrieve what we need, and you could save lives." Hermione immediately felt a knot of suspicion form in her chest. "And what exactly are we retrieving?" Caro's eyes glinted. "A fragment of magic, extremely dark magic. It's believed to be a weapon Voldemort intends to unleash." Harry felt his blood run cold. "And you want us to walk into a Death Eater hideout for it?" McGonagall's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've already made my concerns known," she said sharply. "This is not a task I approve of for students." "But the stakes are higher than they've ever been," Caro cut in. "We're not asking lightly. You have the element of surprise. Adults cannot breach the wards undetected." Hermione's mind raced. The logical part of her screamed that this was madness. But another part, one that had grown bolder since the start of the war, felt a spark of determination. If this was true, if Voldemort really had something powerful hidden away, waiting could be disastrous. Harry's jaw tightened. "If we say yes, what happens next?" Caro's lips curled slightly. "Then we begin your training immediately. And in 3 weeks you go in." Dumbledore spoke then, his voice calm but firm. "This is a dangerous choice. Neither of you will be forced. But I must warn you, if the Ministry's intelligence is correct, this could be one of the most perilous missions you'll ever face." Hermione looked at Harry, her heart pounding. She could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him into danger countless times before. She also knew that if he went, she wouldn't let him go alone. "I'll do it," Harry said. Hermione took a deep breath. "Then so will I." Caro's gaze lingered on them for a moment, a flicker of satisfaction in her expression. "Very well. Training begins tomorrow at dawn." As they left McGonagall's office, the weight of their decision pressed down on them like a storm about to break. This wasn't just another adventure at Hogwarts. This was war, and they had just agreed to step straight into the heart of it. By the time they reached the common room, Hermione's mind was already calculating strategies, spells, and escape routes. Harry, however, was thinking about something else entirely, what they might find inside that hideout, and whether they were truly ready to face it. Neither of them noticed the small, enchanted beetle perched on the windowsill, its tiny wings glinting in the firelight. It had been listening to everything, and it was flying straight toward someone who would make sure Voldemort knew exactly what they were planning. Harry's mind was in turmoil as the group huddled in the room of requirement. The flames in the fireplace crackled softly, casting long shadows across the walls, but no one seemed at ease. Hermione sat beside him, parchment spread out before her, jotting down ideas at a furious pace. Her brows were knitted together in intense concentration, her quills scratching furiously. "We can't keep dodging them forever," she said, breaking the heavy silence. "The longer we wait, the stronger they get. We need to take action." Ron looked uneasy. "Action? Against Death Eaters?" "Hermione, in case you forgot, they've got numbers, and magic most of us haven't even seen before." Harry leaned forward. "We've seen worse. We're not helpless." Hermione's eyes flicked toward him briefly, softening. "That's true. But if we do this, we need a plan. We can't just walk in and start throwing spells around." Ginny crossed her arms. "Then we make a plan. We hit them where they least expect it." Neville, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. "I might know a place they're using. Near Hogsmeade. I saw cloaked figures there last night while doing rounds with Luna." Hermione's quill stopped mid-word. That could be valuable, but we'd need confirmation before risking a confrontation. Harry's thoughts flashed to the last time they underestimated the enemy. It had cost lives. He wouldn't let that happen again. Neville, can you show me tomorrow? I'll go with you. No, Hermione said immediately, her tone sharper than she intended. You're not going alone. Ron smirked slightly. Guess that means we're all going on a field trip. Harry shot him a look, but Hermione's focus remained on the parchment. She began listing spells, defensive wards, jinxes, disarming charms, and strategies for retreat if things went wrong. It wasn't just her intelligence Harry admired. It was the way she thought of every angle, every possible outcome. The next evening, the group left through the secret passage under the cloak. The night air was biting, and frost glistened on the grass. Neville led them through winding paths until they reached the edge of the forest near Hogsmeade. In the distance, faint lights flickered, moving in irregular patterns. There, Neville whispered. Through the trees, Harry could just make out a small clearing with several cloaked figures. They weren't just standing, they were moving around a large, stone object that looked like an altar. Hermione's hand found Harry's arm instinctively. They're performing a ritual. Harry felt his jaw tighten. We need to stop it. Ron hesitated. Mate, there's more than a dozen of them. Then we wait until they're vulnerable, Hermione said. If they're mid-ritual, they'll be focused. That's when we strike. From their hiding spot, the group watched the ritual grow in intensity. The air seemed to hum with magic, the ground vibrating under their feet. Hermione's breath quickened. They're summoning something. The lead Death Eater raised his wand, chanting louder, and a faint shape began to form in the air, dark, twisting, and inhuman. Now, Harry said, his voice low but urgent. Spells erupted from the trees, stunners, disarming charms, and bright jets of light. The Death Eater spun in shock, several collapsing instantly. But the leader didn't falter. He completed the chant, and the shadowy form solidified, letting out a bone-chilling roar. Hermione's voice cut through the chaos. Protego Maxima. Get behind me. A shimmering shield burst to life, blocking a blast of green light. Harry darted forward, hurling a curse at the creature, but it absorbed the magic like smoke. It's feeding on spells, Hermione shouted. We need a different approach, something physical. Neville yanked a fallen branch and enchanted it, swinging hard at the creature's form. To their surprise, it shrieked and recoiled. Harry quickly followed suit, transfiguring debris into weapons. The Death Eaters, disorganized and outnumbered now, began to flee, leaving their creation to fend for itself. It took every ounce of strength and teamwork, but finally, the shadow figure dissolved with a deafening wail, vanishing into nothing. As the group stood panting in the clearing, Hermione clutched Harry's sleeve, her face pale. That was only a fragment of what they're trying to bring back. If they succeed, she trailed off, eyes dark with worry. Harry nodded grimly. Then we make sure they never get the chance. The frost on the ground crunched under their boots as they left, but the cold wasn't what sent shivers down Harry's spine. It was the knowledge that tonight had only been a warning. The Great Hall was alive with the electric tension of the final Quidditch match of the year. The banners of Gryffindor and Slytherin hung from the enchanted ceiling, rippling gently as though moved by an unseen breeze. Students were talking in hushed, excited tones, aware that this game would not just decide the Quidditch Cup, but also carry the weight of pride and rivalry that had grown more complicated than anyone had imagined. Harry and Hermione sat side by side at the Gryffindor table during breakfast, though both barely touched their food. Harry was trying to focus on the game ahead, but his gaze kept drifting toward Hermione, who seemed equally preoccupied, though not with Quidditch. Draco, at the Slytherin table, caught her glance across the room and gave a faint nod. It was almost imperceptible, but Harry noticed. His jaw tightened. He wanted to tell himself it was nothing, maybe just a silent acknowledgement about something academic, but his instincts told him otherwise. By the time they all made their way to the Quidditch pitch, the stands were packed. The crowd's cheers blended into a deafening roar. Ron, as keeper, was already practicing with a determined glint in his eye, while Harry tried to steady himself on his broom. Hermione wasn't playing, of course, but she had insisted on watching from the front row of the Gryffindor stands. The game began in a blur of speed and color. Gryffindor took an early lead, with Ginny weaving through the Slytherin defense like lightning. Draco, however, was relentless as Seeker, shadowing Harry's every move. Their rivalry in the air was as fierce as their rivalry on the ground, each refusing to give an inch. From below, Hermione's eyes kept shifting between them. She didn't know who she was more worried about, Harry for the pressure he carried, or Draco for the danger he seemed to be courting in his determination to beat Harry. It was strange, feeling concern for both sides. The crowd gasped when Harry and Draco nearly collided midair, swerving just in time to avoid sending each other into the stands. Harry could hear Draco's voice, even over the wind. "You'll have to do better than that, Potter," Draco called, his tone half-taunt, half-dare. "And you'll have to be quicker than that, Malfoy," Harry shot back, though there was no true malice in his voice. Minutes passed. Then, as if summoned by fate, the golden snitch appeared, glinting just above the Ravenclaw stands. Both Seekers dove, neck and neck, the sound of the crowd swelling to a fever pitch. Hermione's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the edge of the railing, watching the two of them chase the streak of gold like their lives depended on it. Harry leaned forward, feeling the rush of air whip past his face. Draco was just beside him, his expression determined and unyielding. It became clear they were going to reach the snitch at the exact same moment. In that split second, Harry made a choice, one he couldn't fully explain even to himself, and shifted slightly, letting Draco's fingers close around the snitch first. The Slytherin stands erupted in deafening cheers. Gryffindor's side went silent, then groaned in disappointment. Harry landed lightly, his expression unreadable, while Draco descended holding the snitch high, victorious but also confused. Hermione rushed to Harry before anyone else could. "Why did you?" she began, but Harry just shook his head with a small smile. "Some things," he said quietly, "are bigger than winning a game." Draco's eyes met his from across the pitch, and for the first time, there was no rivalry in his gaze, only something that might have been respect. The great hall was buzzing with anticipation as the evening feast approached. Outside, the last hints of sunlight bled into the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold. Inside, candles floated lazily above the long tables, casting a warm glow on the chatter and clinking cutlery. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, her hands curled around a mug of pumpkin juice, though she barely sipped it. Her mind was elsewhere, tracing over conversations she'd had with Harry in the past week, searching for meaning in every word, every glance. Harry, meanwhile, sat across from her, engaged in conversation with Neville, but his eyes kept darting back to Hermione as though drawn by an invisible thread. The tension between them had become something almost tangible. It wasn't hostile, nor was it entirely comfortable. It was the kind of charged energy that made Ron raise his eyebrows every time he caught them locking eyes for longer than necessary. Dinner passed in a blur for Hermione, who excused herself early, claiming she had homework to finish. Harry waited a few minutes before slipping away as well. He caught up with her in the dim corridor leading to the library, where the flicker of torches painted their shadows on the stone walls. "Leaving so soon?" Harry asked, his voice light but edged with something more. Hermione turned, startled, then softened. "I just needed some quiet." She hesitated, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Everything feels complicated lately." Harry stepped closer, his brow furrowing. "Because of me?" Hermione's heart gave an unsteady thud. "Partly," she admitted, the word tasting both scary and liberating. There was a pause, the kind that made the air thick. Harry's hand twitched as though he wanted to reach out, but he stopped himself. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Hermione. But I can't pretend I don't." He stopped, biting the inside of his cheek. "That I don't notice how different it feels now." Hermione's pulse raced. She opened her mouth to reply, but footsteps echoed down the hall. Ron appeared, holding a book and looking surprised to see them. His eyes flicked from Hermione to Harry, suspicion sparking. "Funny place to be standing around," Ron said flatly. Hermione cleared her throat. "Just talking." She brushed past him toward the library, her pace brisk. Harry watched her go, a hollow ache settling in his chest. Ron's gaze lingered on him a moment longer, then followed her. Later that night, Harry found himself on the astronomy tower, leaning against the cold stone parapet. The stars stretched endlessly above, but his thoughts were tethered to the ground, tangled around Hermione. He knew things couldn't go on like this forever. Either they would drift apart, or they would have to face whatever was building between them. And deep down, Harry wasn't sure which possibility scared him more. The days following the confrontation in the library were heavy with an unspoken tension. Harry found himself caught between the need to confront Ron and the desire to give him space, knowing that every conversation lately ended in sharp words or stony silences. Hermione, on the other hand, seemed to be keeping herself busier than ever, diving into her studies, patrolling the corridors for prefect duties, and spending time with Ginny. Yet, despite her careful avoidance of unnecessary encounters, Harry could see the faint crease in her brow whenever Ron's name came up. It was on a rainy Saturday afternoon that Harry finally decided it was time to talk to Ron. He found him alone in the common room, staring moodily into the fireplace. The light from the flames flickered across Ron's face, highlighting the storm of emotions beneath. Harry took a seat opposite him, waiting for a moment before speaking. "We can't keep this up forever," he said quietly. Ron didn't look away from the fire. "You think I'm the one keeping this going?" His tone was flat, but Harry could hear the edge beneath it. "I'm saying we're supposed to be friends." "All of us," Harry replied, keeping his voice even. "And lately it feels like we're, I don't know, breaking apart." Ron's jaw tightened. "That's not my fault." Harry wanted to argue, but he stopped himself. Instead, he asked, "Then whose fault is it?" Ron finally turned to face him, his blue eyes fierce. "I've seen the way you've been with her. Don't tell me nothing's changed, Harry. You think I'm blind?" Harry felt his stomach drop. So that was it. Ron wasn't just suspicious anymore, he was convinced. "Hermione's my friend," Harry said, though the words felt heavier now, complicated by emotions he couldn't quite hide. Ron scoffed. "Friends don't look at each other the way you two do." There was no easy answer to that, and Harry knew it. Instead of denying it, he leaned back in his chair and looked Ron straight in the eye. "Maybe you're right. But if you think that means I'd ever hurt you or betray you, then you don't know me as well as I thought you did." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but also like a plea. Ron looked away first, muttering something Harry couldn't catch, and stood abruptly. "I need some air," he said, walking out into the corridor without another word. That night, Harry found Hermione in the library again, though she wasn't surrounded by her usual fortress of books. She sat at a small table near the back, staring at the rain tapping against the windows. He approached quietly, and she glanced up with a faint smile. "Everything all right?" she asked, though she clearly didn't believe it. "I talked to Ron," Harry said, taking a seat. Her expression shifted, a flicker of worry crossing her features. "And he knows something's different," Harry admitted. "I didn't deny it." Hermione's eyes searched his face, as if weighing the meaning behind his words. "Harry, if this is going to cause more harm than good." "It's not about good or bad anymore," he interrupted gently. "It's about what's real." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truths, the kind that neither of them was ready to voice out loud yet. Outside, the rain fell harder, blurring the world beyond the window, as if the castle itself was closing them in. Hermione didn't say anything more, but she didn't look away from him either. The moment felt dangerous, fragile, and impossible to ignore. Harry knew then that whatever happened next, there was no going back to how things had been before. The corridors of Hogwarts were quieter than usual as Hermione walked beside Harry, both of them deep in thought. The mystery surrounding Voldemort's daughter had become almost unbearable, and the feeling that they were close to uncovering something monumental only made their nerves sharper. Every creak of the old castle felt like a whisper urging them to look deeper. Hermione's mind kept circling back to the scraps of parchment they'd found in the library archives the night before. Cryptic notes about a prophecy that spoke of blood bound by darkness, yet torn by choice. It was maddeningly vague, but she was certain it was connected to the girl they had been hearing whispers about for weeks. Harry, however, seemed more unsettled by the idea that someone might have been at Hogwarts under a false identity all this time. They rounded a corner and nearly collided with Ginny, who had clearly been running to find them. Her face was flushed, and she clutched a folded piece of parchment in her hand. Without a word, she handed it to Harry. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, but the message was unmistakable. "If you want the truth, come to the astronomy tower at midnight. Come alone." "That's a trap," Hermione said instantly, scanning the words again. Whoever wrote this knows how to lure us in. Midnight alone? It's the oldest trick in the book. Harry nodded slowly, but didn't dismiss the idea. Maybe. Or maybe they know we won't trust it, and that's why they sent it. If this is from her, it could be our only chance to hear her side before everyone else gets to her first. Hermione hesitated, torn between her instinct for caution and her hunger for answers. In the end, she sighed. We'll go, but not alone. We can stay hidden and watch for anything suspicious. That night, the castle was cloaked in a heavy silence as they made their way toward the astronomy tower. The air was crisp, the moon casting silver light over the stone floors. Every step seemed louder than it should have been, and Hermione's hand never strayed far from her wand. They reached the base of the spiral staircase and heard it. Soft footsteps above them, deliberate and slow. Creeping upward, they stopped just before the final turn. A figure stood at the edge of the tower, silhouetted against the moonlight. Her hair was long and dark, and she wore no Hogwarts robes, only a black cloak that fluttered lightly in the breeze. You came, the girl said softly without turning around. Her voice was low, with a strange mix of coldness and sadness. Harry stepped forward cautiously. Are you? Yes, she interrupted, finally turning to face them. Her eyes were sharp, green like Harry's, but with a depth that felt ancient. I am Voldemort's daughter. Hermione's breath caught. She had expected anger or arrogance, but instead there was a quiet intensity in the girl's gaze. I didn't ask to be born into his bloodline, the girl continued. And I didn't come here to harm anyone. I've been hiding because I knew what would happen if the truth came out. You would all see me as a threat, just as they see you, Harry. But my father, he had plans for me. Plans I refused to follow. Hermione exchanged a glance with Harry, both of them silently processing her words. Then why reveal yourself now? Harry asked. The girl stepped closer, lowering her voice. Because you're in danger. The Death Eaters are inside Hogwarts, disguised, waiting for the right moment. And when they strike, they will use you, both of you, to finish what my father started. Before Hermione could respond, a faint sound came from below, footsteps, faster this time, growing closer. The girl's expression hardened. They've found me, she whispered urgently. If you trust me, follow me now. If not, stay here and you'll never get the chance to hear the whole truth. Hermione's heart pounded. They were standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything. Harry looked at her. We go. Hermione swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. We go. And together, they stepped into the shadows after the girl who carried the most dangerous secret in the wizarding world. Hermione sat in the library late into the evening, her quill scratching softly against parchment as she annotated an ancient transfiguration text. She had insisted to herself that studying would help keep her mind clear, but thoughts of Harry had been creeping in more and more lately. She could no longer deny that her feelings for him had shifted beyond friendship, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. Harry appeared at the end of the aisle, holding a small, lopsided grin. I thought I'd find you here, he said softly, walking toward her. The warm flicker of candlelight danced across his face, and Hermione felt her heart skip a beat. You should be resting, she said, closing her book. After Quidditch practice, you always look like you've run a marathon. Can't rest, Harry replied, sliding into the seat opposite her. Too many things on my mind. He hesitated for a moment, studying her expression before continuing. Things and people. Hermione's gaze dropped to the table. The tension between them had been growing for weeks, every accidental touch, every lingering glance. Harry, she began, but the words trailed off. The sound of footsteps broke the moment. Ron appeared, holding a stack of chocolate frog cards, his eyes narrowing at the sight of them together. What are you two doing? He asked, trying to sound casual but failing. Studying, Hermione answered quickly, her tone sharper than she intended. She could feel Ron's jealousy radiating across the table, and she knew that the fragile balance between them was about to crack. Ron smirked, though there was no humor in it. Right. Studying. Late at night. Alone. Harry straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. Ron, it's not. Save it, Ron muttered, turning away. I've seen enough. He walked off without another word, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. Hermione exhaled shakily. "This is getting worse," she whispered. "We can't keep pretending nothing's changed." Harry leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "Then let's stop pretending." Her breath caught, but before she could respond, Madame Pants appeared, shooing them out because the library was closing. They gathered their things in silence, but Hermione's mind was far from quiet. Every step toward the Gryffindor common room felt heavier than the last. When they reached the fat lady's portrait, Harry paused, looking at her with an expression that made her stomach flutter. "We'll talk," he promised. "Properly. Tomorrow." Hermione nodded, but she knew that tomorrow would not be simple. With Ron already suspicious and their feelings no longer hidden so well, they were heading toward a point of no return, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what would happen when they crossed it. The morning sun spilled into the great hall, but the warmth of its rays could not reach Hermione's tense shoulders. She sat at the Gryffindor table, poking absently at her breakfast, her mind far from the chatter around her. Harry had been quieter than usual since yesterday's unsettling discovery about Malfoy's strange late-night excursions, and Ron, still harboring his own private grievances, offered little more than grunts between bites of toast. The silence between the three of them had grown heavier, and Hermione was determined to pierce it. "We can't just ignore this," she said finally, setting down her fork with a decisive clink. "If Malfoy's up to something dangerous, we have to find out what it is." Harry glanced at her, the dark circles under his eyes betraying how little sleep he'd had. "I know," he admitted, his voice low. "But if we confront him without proof, he'll deny everything. And Snape will make sure we look like the ones in the wrong." Ron muttered under his breath. "Wouldn't be the first time." Hermione shot him a sharp look, but he avoided her gaze, busying himself with his pumpkin juice. Hermione leaned closer to Harry. "Then we gather proof. We follow him, document where he goes, and figure out who he's meeting." Harry considered this for a moment before nodding. "Tonight," he agreed. "We'll use the invisibility cloak." Ron looked up, frowning. "You're going to sneak around the castle again? At night, when Filch and Mrs. Norris are lurking about." "Brilliant idea." Hermione's lips thinned. "If you're not interested in helping, no one's forcing you." Ron flushed but said nothing, and the conversation ended there. That evening, long after the rest of Gryffindor Tower had gone to bed, Hermione and Harry slipped out under the shimmering folds of the invisibility cloak. The castle's corridors were draped in shadow, the only sound the faint echo of their footsteps. They waited near the Slytherin common room, careful to keep to the alcoves, until the faint creak of the door signaled movement. Malfoy emerged, glancing both ways down the corridor before heading in the opposite direction from the Great Hall. Hermione and Harry followed silently, their breaths shallow. Malfoy's steps were quick, purposeful, and he seemed to know exactly where he was going. They trailed him through twisting passages until he stopped before a section of wall Hermione recognized, the same place she had once seen him lurking earlier in the term. Malfoy muttered something under his breath, and the wall shifted, revealing a hidden door. Hermione's heart thudded in her chest as they slipped inside before it closed. They found themselves in a dimly lit room that smelled faintly of damp stone and parchment. In the center was a table covered with maps of Hogwarts, strange diagrams, and parchment scrawled with runes. Malfoy was not alone. A hooded figure stood across from him, their voice low and urgent. "You must hurry. If the headmaster suspects—" "I told you, I can handle it," Malfoy interrupted, his voice taut with irritation. "Potter and his friends won't get in my way." Hermione's fingers tightened on Harry's arm. Whoever this person was, they knew about them, and that was dangerous. Before they could hear more, the hooded figure turned suddenly, eyes sweeping the room. Hermione's breath caught. She had the distinct feeling that somehow, impossibly, the figure could sense them through the cloak. Harry tugged her toward the door, and they slipped out, retreating into the corridor. Only when they were halfway back to Gryffindor Tower did they finally stop, their hearts pounding. "Whoever that was," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they're not just some Slytherin friend of Malfoy's. They're involved in something big." Hermione nodded slowly, her mind already racing. "We have to find out who they are. And fast." Neither of them noticed the faint rustle behind them, or the pair of sharp, watchful eyes following their every move. The great hall was eerily silent as Harry, Hermione, and Draco entered together. It was the sort of silence that wasn't born from politeness but from shock. The sight of the Golden Trio, minus Ron, and the Slytherin prince walking side by side was enough to make everyone stop mid-bite. The air seemed to hum with whispers waiting to break free. Hermione ignored the stares, holding her head high, though her heart raced. The encounter in the library the night before still lingered in her mind. Draco's voice low as they spoke about the strange dreams, Harry's uneasy glances, and the shared fear they were finally admitting aloud. Harry slid into his usual spot at the Gryffindor table, but Hermione hesitated, glancing between the two boys. Draco lingered near the end of the Slytherin table, clearly uncomfortable with the entire arrangement. For a moment, it looked like the fragile truce between them would crumble before breakfast even began. But then Hermione sat beside Harry, forcing Draco to take the seat across from her at the Gryffindor table. Gasps rippled through the hall. "We're making people's heads explode," Draco muttered under his breath, stabbing at a slice of toast. Harry shot him a look. "Good. Maybe it'll distract them from staring at Hermione like she's grown 3 heads." Hermione didn't acknowledge the jab, focusing instead on the reason they had all agreed to this uneasy alliance. The dreams. Each of them had experienced visions, flashes of a dark corridor, the echo of someone's laughter, and the image of a small, locked box that seemed to pulse with light. None of them could explain it, and all of them feared what it might mean. After breakfast, they slipped out together before anyone could intercept them. Ron had been avoiding them entirely since the night in the library, and while Hermione missed him, she couldn't deny the sense of relief at not having to face his questions just yet. They made their way to the empty classroom near the charms corridor, the one Professor Flitwick rarely used. Harry cast a quick Muffliato charm, and Draco leaned against the desk, folding his arms. "All right, Granger. You said you found something last night," Draco asked, his voice sharp, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. Hermione nodded, producing a worn, leather-bound book from her bag. "It's not from the restricted section, before you ask, but it's old enough to make even the library's catalog system confused. It talks about something called a resonance bond." Draco frowned. "Sounds like a sappy love charm." "It's not," Hermione said firmly. "It's a magical connection between 3 or more people, usually created unintentionally through shared magic in a dangerous moment. The bond can allow them to share thoughts, emotions, and even visions. The dreams we've been having, they might be connected to it." Harry leaned forward. "So, what caused it?" Hermione hesitated. "I think it might have happened during the fight at the Ministry last year. We all cast spells at the same time to protect one another. Me, you, and," she glanced at Draco, "and Malfoy, when he tried to shield me from that curse." Draco straightened, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. "I didn't do it for you. That curse would have hit me too." "Regardless," Hermione said quickly, "the book says the bond will persist until the magic that created it is resolved. Which means whatever's in that locked box from our dreams is the key." Harry crossed his arms. "Then we need to find it." Draco smirked. "Brilliant deduction, Potter. And how do you suggest we start? Just waltz into the Forbidden Forest and hope the creepy visions lead the way." "Actually," Hermione said, flipping through the book, "there's a locator spell, but it requires all 3 bonded individuals to cast it together. If we do it right, it should lead us to the source." For a moment, none of them spoke. The weight of the task pressed heavily in the room. Finally, Harry nodded. "Let's do it. Tonight." Draco arched an eyebrow. "Fine. But if we end up getting eaten by something in the forest, I'm haunting you both." Hermione allowed herself the smallest smile, though unease still twisted in her stomach. Whatever was in that box, it wasn't going to be something harmless. That night, they met under the cloak of darkness at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. The air was thick and cold, the moon casting a pale glow on the path ahead. Hermione stood between Harry and Draco, wand in hand, heart pounding. "On 3, she whispered. 1, 2, 3. Their voices joined in the incantation, magic crackling in the air around them. A faint golden thread shot from each of their wands, weaving together into a single shimmering cord that drifted forward, disappearing into the trees. The bond had chosen its path, and now they had no choice but to follow. The following morning dawned with a strange heaviness in the air, as though the castle itself anticipated the day's events. Hermione sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the parchment in her hands. The note Draco had slipped to her during dinner the previous evening. Its elegant handwriting read, "Meet me after dinner, Astronomy Tower. We need to talk alone." She had barely slept, the words playing over and over in her head. Draco's face, so determined and vulnerable at the same time, kept intruding into her thoughts. She tried to bury herself in her studies, but even arithmancy failed to hold her attention. Across the great hall, she caught sight of him at breakfast, his eyes briefly meeting hers before flickering away as though nothing was amiss. Ron was oblivious, complaining about the pumpkin juice tasting slightly sour, while Harry studied the prophet, frowning at yet another report of mysterious disappearances. The day dragged on in a haze of lessons and restless anticipation. Hermione kept catching herself tapping her quill against her parchment, eyes darting to the clock. When dinner finally arrived, she forced herself to eat slowly, though her appetite was nearly non-existent. Draco slipped away quietly before dessert, and she waited a few minutes before rising, pretending to leave for the library. Harry glanced at her curiously, but said nothing. The astronomy tower was cool and quiet, lit only by the silver light of the moon. Draco stood near the parapet, his hands clasped behind his back. The moment he heard her footsteps, he turned, his face unreadable. "You came," he said softly. "You asked," Hermione replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's this about?" He hesitated before pulling a small object from his pocket. It was a pendant, intricate silver filigree surrounding a faintly glowing crystal. Hermione felt a strange pull toward it, as if it recognized her. "This was my mother's," Draco explained. "She told me it's older than our family name, older than Hogwarts itself. And it's tied to something that connects to you." Hermione frowned. "Connects to me? How could it?" She stopped mid-sentence as a rush of warmth spread from the pendant toward her, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. Draco's voice was low, urgent. "I think it's tied to the veil in the Department of Mysteries. My mother called it a key, said it can open what's beyond it, or bring something back." Her heart pounded. The veil was a subject she had only ever read about in restricted texts. Ancient, dangerous magic that the Ministry barely understood. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because I'm not the only one looking for it," he replied. "And if they find out it resonates with you, you'll be in danger." A gust of wind swept through the tower, tugging at their robes. Somewhere below, a clock chimed, echoing through the night. Hermione stepped closer, her eyes locked on the pendant. "Then we need to figure out what it does before they do." Draco met her gaze, something fierce in his expression. "Agreed. But that means trusting me completely, even when it gets dangerous." Hermione hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Then we start now." Neither noticed the shadow that lingered just beyond the tower steps, listening to every word. The news of Harry and Hermione's engagement spread quickly throughout Hogwarts, even though they had hoped to keep it quiet for a while. The Daily Prophet wasted no time in printing a front-page headline that morning, complete with a moving photograph of Harry sliding the ring onto Hermione's finger during the private moment they had thought was safe from prying eyes. Someone must have overheard or seen something and sold the story, because now there wasn't a single student, teacher, or portrait in the castle who didn't know. At breakfast in the Great Hall, dozens of eyes turned toward them. Some students whispered excitedly, others looked stunned, and a few, particularly from Slytherin, appeared downright displeased. Ron sat stiffly at the Gryffindor table, avoiding their gaze entirely. Ginny, however, looked a mixture of hurt and resigned, clearly wrestling with emotions she didn't want to show in front of everyone. Hermione kept her head high, though Harry could feel the tension in her hand as he held it under the table. The whispers were loud enough now that they didn't need to strain to hear them. Words like unexpected, scandal, and brilliant match floated through the air in equal measure. Neville smiled warmly at them, while Luna approached with her usual calm. "You know," she said dreamily, "rings are said to connect two people not just by love, but by fate. I think it suits you both." Harry felt a flicker of relief at Luna's words, but Hermione's mind was already spinning with the potential fallout. Their relationship had been controversial enough when it started, with many questioning whether it was just a passing attraction. Now, an engagement while they were still at school? That was bound to draw criticism. By the time they reached their first class, the atmosphere was thick with curiosity. Professor McGonagall kept her composure, but there was a faint upward curve at the corner of her mouth when she called on Hermione to answer a particularly difficult transfiguration question. After class, she motioned for them to stay behind. "I will not pretend this news hasn't reached me," McGonagall began, her tone measured. "While it is unusual for students your age to make such a decision, I have known you both long enough to believe you do not make choices lightly. Still, you must understand that your actions will have consequences both inside and outside Hogwarts." She paused, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "If this is what you truly want, you'll have to face those consequences together." Hermione nodded firmly. "We know, Professor. And we're ready." As they left the classroom, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get far more complicated. It wasn't just about dealing with the gossip. It was about the possibility that Voldemort's followers might now see Hermione not only as Harry's closest friend, but as his fiancée, making her a target. That afternoon, they met in the library to plan how to handle the storm they were in. Hermione was already drafting a carefully worded response for the Prophet, determined to control at least part of the narrative. Harry, meanwhile, was thinking about security, about making sure she was safe no matter what happened next. Neither of them noticed Ron lingering at the end of the aisle, hidden between the shelves, his jaw tight, and his eyes clouded with something far more complicated than simple anger. He turned away silently, disappearing before they could see him, and his mind was already forming a plan, one that might force them to choose between love and loyalty. The night was unnervingly still as Harry, Hermione, and Ron stepped through the moonlit clearing. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and moss, and an unnatural hush settled over the forbidden forest. Every footstep seemed louder than it should have been. Hermione's hand clutched the strap of her bag tightly, her wand ready in the other. Harry could feel her tension beside him, though she didn't speak. Ron trailed slightly behind, glancing over his shoulder as if he half expected something to leap out of the darkness. "This is it," Harry said softly, pointing toward a cluster of twisted oaks ahead. "That's where the centaur said we'd find it." They approached the trees cautiously, each one towering high, their branches knotted like clenched fists. At the base of the largest oak, the ground dipped into a hollow. Something shimmered faintly there, a soft silvery glow that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Hermione knelt down first, brushing away a layer of damp leaves until the object beneath revealed itself. It was a crystal, no larger than a clenched fist, cradled in a nest of roots. The glow emanated from within, warm and strange. Hermione's eyes widened. "It's beautiful. But this kind of magic, I've never seen anything like it." Harry crouched beside her, reaching out cautiously. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the glow flared brighter, and a wave of warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't painful. It was comforting, as though someone had just wrapped him in a thick blanket on a winter night. Ron edged closer, his face tense. "Is it safe? Or is this the part where something big and unpleasant comes to eat us?" Hermione glanced at him sharply. "I think it's a life bond crystal. Ancient magic. The centaurs must have been guarding it for centuries." Before Harry could respond, a sudden rustling erupted from the shadows. 3 figures stepped into the clearing, hooded, silent, and holding wands raised. The glow from the crystal seemed to draw them like moths to a flame. "Drop it," the tallest of the strangers ordered, his voice rough and cold. "That belongs to us." Harry stood quickly, crystal in hand, feeling the weight of its warmth spread through his arm. "It doesn't belong to you," he said firmly. "The forest gave it to us." The leader took a step forward, but Hermione moved to stand between them, wand aimed steadily at his chest. Her voice didn't waver. "You'll have to go through me." The standoff was tense, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the crystal. And then, from deeper in the forest, a low, resonating sound began to build, a rhythmic thump like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The hooded figures faltered, their eyes darting toward the trees. From the shadows emerged a massive centaur, his bow drawn and aimed directly at the intruders. His voice was deep and commanding. "Leave. Now. This is not your place." The strangers hesitated only a moment before vanishing into the darkness, their disapparition cracks echoing faintly through the trees. Harry let out the breath he'd been holding. The centaur lowered his bow and looked at him gravely. You hold a gift meant only for those who will protect it. Do not misuse it, Harry Potter. It will protect you in ways you do not yet understand. With that, the centaur turned and disappeared among the trees. Hermione's gaze stayed fixed on the crystal in Harry's hand, the light still pulsing softly. We need to find out what this really does, she whispered. I have a feeling it's not just a relic, it's part of something much bigger. Harry nodded, the weight of the night pressing on him. Deep inside, he knew this crystal was going to change everything. The atmosphere at Hogwarts was heavy with tension, though no one could quite pinpoint why. Harry noticed it most during meals in the Great Hall. The subtle glances, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he or Hermione walked by. Even Draco seemed more on edge than usual, his confidence tempered by an unspoken caution. Hermione, however, had thrown herself into her studies with such intensity that it was hard to get more than a few distracted words out of her, unless the topic was directly related to schoolwork. One cold afternoon, Harry found her alone in the library, sitting at a table piled high with books. The flickering light from the enchanted lantern above her cast shadows over her determined face. She didn't notice him until he sat down across from her. You've been avoiding everyone, Harry said quietly. Hermione looked up, her eyes guarded. Not avoiding. Just busy. She closed the book in front of her with a sigh. You've noticed, haven't you? How people are acting lately. Yeah, Harry admitted. It's like they know something we don't. Hermione hesitated, then leaned closer. I think they do. I overheard 2 Ravenclaws talking about a meeting in the astronomy tower last night. They said it wasn't safe for certain people anymore. Her voice dropped even lower. Harry, they meant you. Harry frowned. Why? What's going on? Before she could answer, Draco appeared from between the rows of shelves, his usual swagger dampened by a strange seriousness. He set a folded piece of parchment on the table in front of Harry. You need to see this, he said. Harry opened it, recognizing the tight, slanted handwriting immediately. It was from an anonymous sender, but the tone was urgent. You're being watched. Trust no one outside your circle. Tonight, the truth will reveal itself. Hermione's face paled. Who sent that? Draco shook his head. No idea. It was left in my bag during potions. But I think they're right. Something's brewing. And it's not just about house rivalries anymore. Harry's stomach tightened. Then we need to find out who's behind it before they make their move. Hermione's voice was firm. Tonight, we follow the whispers to the astronomy tower. If they're planning something, we'll see it for ourselves. Draco smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Finally, a bit of excitement. Just hope we're not walking straight into their trap. That night, cloaked in invisibility and silence, the 3 of them moved through the darkened corridors. The castle was eerily still, the usual creaks and groans replaced by an unsettling quiet. When they reached the astronomy tower, they found the heavy door slightly ajar. Voices drifted out, low, urgent, and unfamiliar. Peering through the gap, they saw a small group huddled around a table, the moonlight revealing their faces. Harry's breath caught when he recognized one of them, a professor. Hermione's eyes widened in shock. The professor was speaking in a hushed tone. We have to act soon. If Potter finds out, everything falls apart. Harry's grip on his wand tightened. Hermione gave him a sharp look, her silent signal to wait. But the weight of the revelation made it almost impossible to stay still. And then one of the figures turned toward the door, as if sensing them. The night over Hogwarts was unnaturally still, the sky heavy with a darkness that seemed to press against the castle walls. Harry lay awake in his 4-poster bed, staring at the canopy above, his mind plagued by a gnawing unease. He had hoped that after the ordeal with Draco and the revelations about Hermione's feelings, things would settle down. But deep down, he knew the calm was only an illusion. Whispers had begun to spread again, about strange disappearances in nearby wizarding villages, about a shadowy figure seen drifting through the forbidden forest at night. Hermione had grown quieter in the past few days, her mind clearly preoccupied with something she hadn't yet shared. Even Ron seemed more on edge, though he masked it with sarcasm and forced laughter at the Gryffindor table. Harry pushed the blankets aside, unable to rest any longer, and moved toward the common room. The fire was still crackling, dim but warm, and he was surprised to find Hermione curled up in one of the armchairs, a large, weathered book open on her lap. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "You're up late," she said softly. "So are you," Harry replied, sitting down across from her. "What's going on, Hermione? You've been distant lately." She hesitated, closing the book slowly. "I've been researching something. Ever since those disappearances started, I had a feeling they were connected to the things we faced last year. And now I'm certain they are." Harry frowned. "What do you mean?" Hermione's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not just random attacks. Whoever's behind this, they're looking for something. Something powerful. And I think it's hidden somewhere in Hogwarts." Before Harry could respond, the portrait hole swung open, and Ginny stepped in, her expression grim. "You two need to hear this. Professor McGonagall just told the prefects there's been another attack. This time in Hogsmeade." Harry's stomach dropped. "Who?" "Madame Rosmerta," Ginny said quietly. "She's alive, but she's not herself. It's like she's under some sort of curse." Hermione's hand gripped the edge of her book tightly. "We have to act fast. If my theory is right, and the artifact they're searching for is real, then this isn't just about attacks. It's about preparing for something much worse." Harry felt the weight of her words settle over him like a storm cloud. He had faced danger before, but this was different. There was a deliberate, methodical plan unfolding in the shadows, and they were running out of time to stop it. The firelight flickered, and for a moment, Harry thought he saw a dark, hooded figure standing in the corner of the common room. He blinked, and it was gone, but the sense of being watched lingered. Hermione leaned forward, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to go to the library tomorrow, into the restricted section. If we're right about what's happening, we'll find the answers there. But we have to be ready for whatever we might uncover." Harry nodded slowly, the tension in his chest tightening. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The darkness that had once threatened Hogwarts was returning, and this time, it felt more dangerous than ever. The winter at Hogwarts seemed heavier than usual, as if the very walls were bracing themselves for what was to come. News from the wizarding world spoke of skirmishes and disappearances. Students whispered in the corridors, their eyes darting nervously to shadows, half expecting them to move. Harry, Hermione, and their allies knew these were not just rumors. War was pressing closer to the castle's gates. Hermione sat in the library one evening, surrounded by parchments and maps. She traced her finger over a chart of the Forbidden Forest, marking certain areas with red ink. Harry approached quietly, pulling out the chair beside her. "Still trying to find a pattern?" he asked, glancing at the scattered reports of sightings. "Yes," she said without looking up. "The last 3 attacks all happened along these boundaries. If I'm right, Voldemort's forces are closing in a way that cuts off all possible escape routes from the north side." She finally looked at him, her voice steady but urgent. "If he seals off the valley, Hogwarts will be surrounded." Harry frowned. "We need to warn McGonagall." "She already knows," Hermione said. "She's reinforcing the magical wards, but if what I've read about ancient siege-breaking spells is true, they might not hold forever." Before they could say more, Neville entered, his face pale. "You both need to come to the room of requirement. Now." Inside the room, members of the DA were gathered. Ginny stood at the front, holding a letter in trembling hands. "It's from my mum," she began, her voice cracking. "The burrow was attacked. Everyone's alive, but the place is gone." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Harry's hands clenched into fists. "This is just intimidation," he said coldly. "He's trying to scare us into giving up." "Then we give him nothing," Ginny replied fiercely. Hermione stepped forward, her mind already racing. "We can't just defend anymore. We need to outthink him. If he's surrounding Hogwarts, it's because he wants us trapped. So we find a way to move in and out without him knowing. Secret passages, hidden wards, anything." "That's risky," Dean Thomas said. "It's war," Hermione replied, her tone unyielding. "If we wait for him to come, we lose the advantage." That night, Harry and Hermione pored over the Marauder's map, searching for any sign of unusual movement within the castle grounds. A strange dot appeared briefly near the Whomping Willow before vanishing. Harry exchanged a look with Hermione. "That's not normal." "No," she agreed, closing the map. And I have a feeling it's exactly where we need to start. They didn't yet know that what lay beyond the willow would lead them to a discovery capable of tipping the war. But only if they were willing to take the most dangerous risk yet. The corridors of Hogwarts seemed colder than ever that evening. Hermione walked quickly, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. The events of the past few days had left her restless, her thoughts tangled between suspicion and disbelief. Harry had been unusually distant, and Ron's sudden reappearance after disappearing for days had only deepened her unease. She found Harry in the library, sitting at a corner table with a book open before him, though his eyes were unfocused. Hermione approached slowly, her voice cautious. "Harry, we need to talk." He looked up, and for a brief second, there was relief in his expression, until it was replaced by guarded hesitation. "I know," he said quietly, closing the book. "Things are complicated right now." Hermione sat down across from him. "Then let's uncomplicate them. Ron told me something I really hope isn't true." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "He said you've been meeting with someone you shouldn't be." Harry's jaw tightened. "Hermione, you have to trust me. Not everything is what it looks like." "That's the problem," she whispered. "Nothing looks right anymore." Before he could respond, a shadow flickered at the edge of the library's candlelight. Both of them turned, and there was Ron, half hidden behind a tall bookshelf. His expression was unreadable. He stepped forward, eyes shifting between the two of them. "I just wanted to make sure you're safe, Hermione," Ron said, but there was an undercurrent in his tone that made her uneasy. Harry stood. "Safe from what, Ron?" "From me?" Ron's lips curved into a thin, humorless smile. "You're keeping secrets, Harry. You've been sneaking out at night, and you've been seen near the Forbidden Forest. That's not nothing." Hermione's gaze darted between them. "If you're accusing him of—" "I'm not accusing," Ron interrupted sharply. "I'm warning." The tension was thick, the air heavy with something unspoken. Then, before another word could be said, a loud crash echoed from somewhere down the hall. The three of them turned toward the sound, instinctively reaching for their wands. They rushed out of the library and into the dimly lit corridor, the smell of smoke drifting toward them. As they rounded the corner, Hermione froze. The tapestry of the Founders lay torn on the ground, and in its place was a large scorch mark on the wall, shaped disturbingly like the dark mark. Harry stepped closer, his expression grim. "Someone's trying to send a message." Ron glanced at him sharply. "Or someone's already chosen a side." Hermione's heart pounded as she realized they were being pulled into something far bigger than a school rivalry or personal conflict. Trust was fracturing, and every shadow in Hogwarts seemed to carry the whisper of betrayal. And somewhere deep in the castle, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching and waiting. The tension in the Gryffindor common room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hermione sat at one of the tables near the fire, her books spread out in a perfect line, quills scratching furiously on parchment. She didn't look up when Ron entered, though she knew he was there. The sudden drop in chatter and the sideways glances told her as much. Ron approached with that heavy-footed determination he always had when he thought he was about to win an argument. He stopped at her table and folded his arms. "We need to talk." Hermione didn't stop writing. "About what?" she asked flatly, her tone void of the patience she used to have for him. "You know what?" Ron snapped, lowering his voice so the rest of the common room wouldn't hear. "You've been avoiding me for weeks. And don't tell me it's just studying, because you've been plenty available to Harry." Hermione set her quill down with deliberate calm. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp and steady. "I'm not avoiding you, Ron. I'm simply choosing not to be dragged into pointless arguments or petty jealousy." Ron's ears turned red. "Petty? You're practically glued to Harry's side lately. It's like I don't even exist to you anymore." Hermione felt the familiar flare of frustration. "Ron, you've made it very clear that you can't be happy unless things go exactly the way you want them to. I'm tired of being the target of your moods. I'm friends with Harry because he treats me with respect. You—" She stopped herself, realizing she was dangerously close to saying something she couldn't take back. But Ron pressed forward. "Go on. Say it. You think he's better than me, don't you?" Hermione's lips thinned. "I think Harry understands me in a way you never bothered to try." The words came out quietly but with finality. For a moment, Ron just stared at her, his expression wavering between anger and hurt. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the boys' staircase. Harry, who had been lingering by the portrait hole pretending to look at the notice board, crossed the room to her side. "You all right?" he asked softly. Hermione nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I will be," she said, forcing a small smile. I think that might have been the last straw for Ron." Harry took a seat beside her, lowering his voice. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Sometimes, some friendships aren't meant to last forever. Not if they keep hurting you." She looked at him, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. The firelight danced over his features, and for a moment she saw not just her friend, but someone who had been a constant in her life in ways Ron never had. A silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Harry leaned back slightly, glancing toward the staircase where Ron had disappeared. "Whatever happens," he said, "I'm not going anywhere." Hermione's eyes softened. "I know." Outside, the wind howled against the castle walls, rattling the windows. Inside, something fragile between them began to solidify. No longer just unspoken trust, but the first steps toward something more. The Forbidden Forest was unusually silent that night, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made every heartbeat sound louder. Hermione stood at the edge of the trees, her wand clutched tightly in her hand. She knew Draco was somewhere inside, chasing after the hooded figure they had both seen fleeing the castle grounds. The air was thick with mist, curling low across the damp ground, making the path ahead almost invisible. She stepped forward cautiously, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, the forest seeming to swallow all light. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a faint rustle, and her pulse quickened. She called out softly, "Draco?" But only her own voice came back, muffled and eerie. She pushed deeper into the forest, each step heavier than the last, the tension coiling in her stomach like a serpent. Then she saw it, faint green light ahead, flickering like a dying lantern. She quickened her pace until she reached a small clearing. There, standing in the middle, was Draco. His wand arm was raised, but his eyes were fixed on something ahead of him. Hermione followed his gaze and froze. A figure cloaked in black was kneeling over what looked like an ancient stone altar, strange runes glowing faintly beneath their hands. The figure's voice was low, chanting in a language neither of them recognized, and the air around them shimmered as though reality itself was bending. Draco's voice cut through the tension. "Stop what you're doing now." His tone was sharp, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, the runes flared brighter, and a wave of cold rushed out in all directions, making Hermione's breath come out in white puffs. She stepped forward, her own wand raised. Expelliarmus. The spell shot forward in a streak of red light, but just before it struck, the figure raised a hand and the magic dissipated into nothing. Hermione stumbled back, startled by the effortless counter. The figure finally turned to face them, and beneath the hood, two eyes gleamed unnaturally bright, their color shifting like molten metal. "Too late," the figure whispered, their voice chilling and inhuman. "The darkness has returned, and you cannot stop it." Before either of them could react, a surge of shadow burst outward, engulfing the clearing in a wave of black mist. Hermione felt the ground vanish beneath her feet as if she were falling into endless night. She heard Draco shout her name, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the forest. She stood in a vast, empty space where the sky was blood-red and the ground was covered in jagged black stone. A towering figure loomed in the distance, watching her with an unreadable expression. She felt a tug in her mind, a pull towards something she didn't understand. And then she heard the figure speak. Her name, spoken in a voice that seemed to echo through her very bones. The darkness was no longer just returning. It had already begun. Hermione sat in the dimly lit Gryffindor common room, the flicker of the fire casting long shadows across her face. Her thoughts raced endlessly, weaving between the recent chaos, Harry's sudden confessions, and the weight of what was about to happen. Every word Harry had spoken to her in the past week seemed to echo louder now, each moment laced with urgency. The war outside Hogwarts was growing darker by the day, but inside, the quiet moments between them had become her only anchor. She ran her fingers along the worn edge of the couch, staring into the flames, when the portrait hole creaked open. Harry stepped through, his expression tired, but his green eyes locked onto her immediately. He moved toward her without hesitation, as if drawn by an invisible thread. "You're still awake," he said softly, dropping into the seat beside her. "I could say the same for you," she replied, her tone gentle yet filled with the questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Harry leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, watching the fire as if it could offer him guidance. "I needed to see you," he admitted after a pause. Her chest tightened. "Something's happening, isn't it?" He didn't look away from the flames. "It's getting closer. Voldemort knows too much now, and I don't think we have much time left." His voice trembled slightly, but he masked it with a deep breath. "When it happens, Hermione, I need you to promise me something." She frowned. "Harry, don't start talking like this. Promise me you'll stay safe. That you'll keep fighting, no matter what happens to me." Hermione shook her head sharply, her hair falling over her face. "No, I won't promise that. Because if you think for 1 second that I'll just stand aside while you—" her voice cracked. "While you throw yourself into danger without me, you're wrong." He finally turned toward her, and the pain in his eyes made her breath hitch. "You're the one thing I can't risk losing," he whispered. She swallowed hard, her heart thundering. "And you think I could just lose you?" Silence fell between them, heavy and unspoken. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks into the air. Harry reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against hers. For a moment neither of them moved, but then her hand curled into his, warm and steady. They sat there, holding on to each other like the world outside didn't exist, even though they both knew it would soon come crashing in. Somewhere deep down, Hermione knew these moments were numbered, and that terrified her more than anything. When they finally stood, the fire was dying down, its glow fading into embers. Harry lingered at the base of the stairs, his hand still holding hers for a second longer before letting go. "Good night, Hermione," he murmured, though the weight in his tone said much more. She watched him disappear up the steps, the echoes of his words still tangled with the pounding of her heart. The storm was coming, and neither of them could outrun it. But if this was the end, Hermione knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let him face it alone. The soft dawn light streamed through the great hall's high windows, casting long golden streaks across the tables. Hogwarts was quieter than it had been in years. The air was lighter, yet tinged with the bittersweet awareness that an era was ending. Harry sat near the Gryffindor table, his eyes sweeping across the hall and lingering on Hermione. She stood near the staff table, speaking to Professor McGonagall, her hands moving animatedly as they discussed the rebuilding plans for the school. Hermione caught Harry's gaze and smiled softly, that familiar warmth in her eyes making him feel grounded. Over the past months, their bond had only deepened, built on years of friendship, trust, and shared battles. She walked over, her hair catching the sunlight in a way that made Harry momentarily forget the heaviness of the moment. "It's strange," Hermione said quietly, sitting beside him. "For so long we fought for this. And now that it's here, it feels almost unreal." Harry nodded, glancing around at the familiar banners and enchanted candles. "I know. Part of me feels like I should be preparing for the next fight. But there isn't one, not anymore. It's over." A group of younger students passed by, chatting excitedly about summer plans. It was a sound Harry hadn't heard at Hogwarts in years, a pure, innocent excitement untouched by fear. It made his chest tighten with both relief and hope. Hermione leaned forward, her tone more thoughtful now. "You know, I used to think the end would mean we'd all go our separate ways. But I don't think that's true. I think we've all been through too much to just let each other go." Harry's lips curved into a faint smile. "So you're saying I'm stuck with you?" "Completely," she replied, her grin matching his. "Besides, you'd be lost without me." Before Harry could answer, Ron appeared, a plate of toast in his hands and that familiar mischievous look on his face. "Well, looks like some things never change. You two sitting here talking about feelings. Don't go getting all sentimental without me." Harry and Hermione exchanged a glance, then burst into laughter. Ron joined in, and for a moment, the three of them were just friends again. No war, no titles, no weight of destiny hanging over them. After breakfast, the trio wandered through the castle, revisiting old haunts. They paused outside the library, where Hermione's eyes softened at the sight of Madame Pant's shelving books. They stood at the entrance to the Gryffindor common room, smiling at the fat lady's portrait, who welcomed them warmly despite knowing they no longer lived there. Eventually, they found themselves by the Black Lake. The surface shimmered under the morning sun, and the giant squid's tentacle waved lazily in greeting. Harry looked out at the water, remembering the countless times he had stood here, sometimes afraid, sometimes determined, and now, finally, at peace. Hermione turned to face him fully. "So, what now, Harry?" He thought about it for a moment, watching the sunlight dance across the lake. "Now we live. We make a life worth everything we fought for. We make sure it was all for something." Hermione's eyes glistened, but she smiled. "That sounds like a plan." Ron clapped a hand on each of their shoulders. "And whatever happens, we do it together." Harry looked at them, his best friends, his family in every way that mattered, and felt a quiet certainty settle in his heart. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. The three of them stood there in the golden morning light, the castle behind them, the open world ahead. For the first time in years, Harry felt the future was his to shape, not as the boy who lived, but as Harry Potter. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that this was not an ending at all. It was only the beginning.